Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The woods seemed to breathe as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows twisting and elongating into dark, grasping fingers. There was a sense of unease I couldn't quite shake, as if the whole forest had gone silent to listen. That's when I saw it. An outline, dark and unmistakably wrong, that moved with a strangely fluid grace. For a moment, I wished it was just my imagination, but the rustling of leaves told me otherwise. It all started with what was supposed to be a quick evening hike. The workday had been long, draining, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a forest walk was the only thing I knew could reset me. I threw my gear into the back of my Jeep, strapped on my worn-out hiking boots, and headed to the trailhead. It wasn't far from where I lived, just a few miles out, really, but far enough from the noise of the town that I could pretend civilization didn't exist for a while. I liked that. The sun was low when I parked, a warm orange glow spilling between the branches. I grabbed my small backpack, more out of habit than need. Inside it were the basics: water, a headlamp, a granola bar. I wasn't planning to stay out long, just enough to clear my head. I knew the area well enough to be confident, even if the sun was sinking fast. The trailhead sign looked worn, splintering at the edges. The map almost faded from too many seasons of sun, wind, and rain. I knew every bend and twist in the trail by heart anyway. It wasn't long before I slipped into a kind of comfortable autopilot. My boots crunched along the narrow path, the gravel shifting beneath me in a familiar rhythm. The towering pine trees swayed softly overhead, the late summer air still heavy with the day's warmth. The usual rustling of small critters and birds added an almost musical soundtrack to my hike. I'd always found these woods comforting, like an old friend that never asked too much, just offered a quiet escape when I needed it. But as I walked further in, that comfortable soundtrack began to fade, and something began to gnaw at the edges of my consciousness. The rustling of branches stilled, as if the forest were holding its breath. The quiet was so sudden and complete, it pressed against my ears, a thick sort of silence that felt unnatural. I brushed it off at first, telling myself that the evening air had stilled. The birds would start again soon. My pace slowed. It was almost subconscious, my body responding before my mind could catch up. The hairs on my arms prickled, the weight of the silence bearing down, until I felt like even my breathing was too loud. That's when I saw it. Just a flicker of movement up ahead, barely caught in my peripheral vision. I turned my head slowly, half expecting to see a deer, maybe a coyote. But what I saw wasn't an animal that belonged in these woods. There, about 50 feet ahead of me, partially hidden by a cluster of thick pines, stood a figure. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, its silhouette almost canine, but wrong. The way it stood on two legs made my stomach twist with unease. I blinked, as if trying to reset my vision, to make sense of what I was seeing. The light was dim, and for a brief moment I almost convinced myself that it was just a trick of the fading sun. But then it moved, and the fluidity of it made my breath hitch in my throat. It stepped out from behind the tree, and I could see it more clearly. The hunched shoulders, elongated limbs, the head shaped like a wolf, but with eyes that reflected an eerie intelligence. It watched me. The way a predator watches something, it's deciding whether or not to hunt. Panic hit me in a wave, cold and electric, my legs tensed, ready to bolt, but something inside me held back. Running, that's what prey does. I tried to swallow, my mouth suddenly dry, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. I took a step back, then another, moving as slowly as I could manage. The creature shifted, and I heard it, the soft crack of a branch breaking beneath its weight. It was enough to snap me out of my frozen stupor. My instinct screamed at me to move, and I turned on my heel, breaking into a sprint down the trail, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. The forest blurred around me, the trees darkening as the sun continued to dip below the horizon. My breaths were ragged, the air catching in my throat as I ran. I could hear it now. The sound of something large moving behind me, not quite running, more like a purposeful, steady advance, like it knew there was no rush. I dared not look back. My body surged forward, my feet pounding against the path, my mind racing with a single thought: get to the car. The trail twisted sharply, and I nearly lost my footing, stumbling over an exposed root. I caught myself just in time, but my headlamp slipped out of my bag and tumbled into the underbrush. I had no time to retrieve it. I pushed on, the dimness growing more profound as night fell around me, my vision reduced to little more than shadows. And then, ahead, the glint of metal, my jeep. Relief shot through me like an electric current, spurring me forward. I reached the vehicle, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I jammed the key into the ignition, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The forest loomed behind me, a wall of darkness. I half expected to see those eyes, glowing out from between the trees, but there was nothing, just the quiet, yawning black. My fingers fumbled, finally managing to turn the key, the engine roaring to life, the headlights cutting into the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the beams, a flash of fur, a shifting shadow, but then it was gone. Swallowed by the night, I didn't waste time. The tires spun against the loose gravel, the jeep jerking forward as I pulled away from the trailhead, the headlights sweeping across the forest as I turned onto the dirt road. My heart still pounded, the adrenaline not yet fading. It wasn't until I was several miles down the road, the forest thinning around me, that I finally let myself exhale. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands still shaking as I rested them on the steering wheel. My breaths came in shallow gasps, and I tried to steady myself, forcing air into my lungs. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, expecting to see what? That thing chasing after me. It was absurd. It had to be. Maybe it was a bear, a sick, mutated bear, or maybe the dimming light had played tricks on my eyes. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the memory of that movement, the way it had stood there watching me, it didn't fit. Nothing I knew, no animal I could think of, moved like that. It had intelligence behind those eyes, and it had watched me like it knew exactly what I was. After a long while, I finally shifted the jeep into gear again, pulling back onto the road. The quiet hum of the tires on asphalt eventually began to soothe me, and the normalcy of it all made me feel almost foolish. Maybe I really had imagined it. Maybe my mind had taken the fading light and turned shadows into monsters. After all, I was tired. I'd been stressed. People imagine things all the time. By the time I got home, the world felt almost normal again. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights casting warm pools of light across the pavement. I pulled into my driveway, cutting the engine, and for a moment, I just sat there, the silence of the evening wrapping around me. I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror, my eyes tired and wide, my face pale. Then, from the woods behind my house, I heard it. A rustling, faint but deliberate. My body tensed, a chill running down my spine. Slowly, I turned my head, peering through the darkness, my breath caught in my chest. And there, at the edge of the tree line, just barely illuminated by the glow of the streetlight, were two reflective eyes watching me. They blinked once, then disappeared into the dark. I stumbled out of the jeep, nearly tripping over my own feet as I rushed to the door, my keys rattling in my hands. I got inside, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it, bolting it. My heart hammered, every muscle in my body strung tight as I strained to hear anything, any sign that it had followed. But there was only silence, the same heavy, unnatural silence that had filled the woods. I backed away from the door, my eyes never leaving the small window that looked out to the backyard. Nothing moved. The world seemed to hold its breath, the seconds stretching into eternity. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, listening. Eventually, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving me exhausted, my legs trembling beneath me. I made my way to the living room, collapsing onto the couch, my eyes still darting to every window, every shadow. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night. I didn't even bother trying. All I could do was sit there, waiting for dawn, and hope, pray, that whatever I'd seen would stay in the forest where it belonged. Story 2. I never should have taken this job. That's what I kept telling myself as I drove down the winding forest road, my headlights barely cutting through the thick fog. But fresh out of college, with a degree in wildlife biology and a mountain of student debt, I couldn't turn down the forest ranger position, even if it meant being stationed at the most remote outpost in the entire state. The radio crackled to life, startling me. "Sarah, you copy. Over." I fumbled for the handset. "I copy, Rick. What's up? Over. We've got reports of some disturbance at Pinewood Camp. Probably just some rowdy campers. But can you swing by and check it out? Over." I glanced at the clock. 11:23 p.m. "Great. 10 to 4. I'm about 15 minutes out. I'll radio when I get there. Over and out." As I hung up the radio, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. Something about this didn't feel right. Pinewood Camp was way off the beaten path, not the kind of place that usually attracted trouble. But I shook it off, probably just my nerves. I was still new at this, after all. The fog grew thicker as I turned onto the dirt road leading to the campground. My truck's suspension groaned as I navigated the rutted path. The trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches scraping against the windows like bony fingers. Finally, I saw the weathered wooden sign for Pinewood Camp looming out of the mist. I pulled into the small parking area and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and oppressive. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel. The beam of light swept across the empty lot. No other vehicles. Odd for this time of year. Usually there'd be at least a few campers, even midweek. "Hello?" I called out. "Forest Service. Anyone here?" My voice echoed back at me, swallowed up by the towering pines. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. I made my way towards the main camping area, my flashlight bobbing in front of me. The fog seemed to part grudgingly, revealing only a few feet ahead at a time. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I stopped dead in my tracks. The beam of my flashlight fell on a scene of utter devastation. Tents lay in shreds, their contents strewn across the clearing. Camping chairs were overturned and crushed. A Coleman stove lay twisted and mangled like it had been tossed around by a tornado. "What the hell?" I muttered, my heart pounding in my chest. I approached the nearest tent cautiously, noting the long gashes in the fabric. These weren't tears from normal wear and tear. The edges were ragged, like something with enormous claws had ripped through it. I keyed my radio. "Rick, you there?" "Over." Static hissed for a moment before his voice came through. "Go ahead, Sarah. Over." "I'm at Pinewood. There's been some kind of incident. The whole place is trashed. No sign of any campers. Over." A pause. "Any signs of wildlife? Bear activity, maybe." Over. I was about to respond when something caught my eye. I crouched down, examining the soft earth near the destroyed tent. "Negative on bear activity," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But there are tracks here, big ones, like nothing I've ever seen before. Over." "Say again, over." I swallowed hard. "The prints, they're huge, easily twice the size of a grizzly, but they're different. Almost like a really big human foot, but with claws. I don't know how else to describe it." "Over?" More static. When Rick's voice came back, it was tense. "Sarah, I want you to get back in your vehicle and leave the area immediately. We'll send a team out in the morning." "Over." A twig snapped in the woods behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the mist. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a massive, dark shape moving between the trees. Then it was gone. "Rick," I hissed into the radio. "And there's something out here. I think I just saw." A low, rumbling growl cut through the night air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite bear, not quite wolf, but somehow more primal and terrifying than both combined. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The fog seemed to be closing in, limiting my vision even further. Another growl, closer this time. I could feel it reverberating in my chest. "Sarah, do you copy? Get out of there now! Over!" Rick's frantic voice snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the dirt trail. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted through the woods, my lungs burning. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with each passing second. I burst out of the tree line into the parking area, fumbling for my keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As I clambered into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the woods, stood a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes glowed an eerie yellow in the reflection of my taillights. But what struck me most were its hands. Enormous, with wickedly curved claws that looked like they could tear through metal as easily as the tent fabric. I cranked the engine and threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the gravel. The creature let out a bone-chilling roar and charged. I slammed the gear shift into drive and floored it, just as a huge, hairy arm swiped at my side mirror. The truck fishtailed as I careened down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. It wasn't until I was miles away, with the first hints of dawn lightening the sky, that I finally pulled over. My whole body was shaking as the adrenaline wore off. I tried to make sense of what I'd seen, to rationalize it somehow. But I knew, deep down, that I'd encountered something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist. I sat there for a long time, watching the sun rise and trying to figure out what to put in my official report. How could I possibly explain what had happened without sounding completely insane? In the end, I decided to stick to the facts. Destroyed campsite, unusual tracks, unidentified animal sighting. Let the higher-ups draw their own conclusions. But I knew I'd never forget that night at Pinewood Camp. The terrifying roar, the glowing eyes, the sheer impossible size of the creature. It changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and it made me realize that deep in the wilderness, in the darkest corners of the forest, there are still mysteries beyond our understanding. Monsters that lurk in the shadows, waiting to remind us that we are not always at the top of the food chain. As I finally started my truck and headed back to the ranger station, one thought kept repeating in my mind. I really should have taken that boring office job instead. Story 3. The first thing I noticed was the smell. An overpowering stench like something had crawled out of the grave and was rotting right there in the forest. It wrapped around me, heavy and nauseating. And that was when I knew something wasn't right. My instincts told me to leave, but curiosity held me there, my feet rooted to the ground. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing through the trees. It had started out as just another weekend camping trip, a way for my girlfriend Sarah and me to get away from the bustle of town life. We both loved the outdoors. The feeling of freedom that came from being surrounded by nothing but trees and sky, the way the world seemed to quiet down in a way it never did back in the city. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and headed for one of our favorite spots, a secluded area deep in the forest that we'd camped at a few times before. It was supposed to be perfect. The drive was easy enough, the narrow, winding road, taking us further and further away from civilization until there was nothing but pines and winding stretches of gravel. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sky a bright, cloudless blue, the air heavy with the scent of pine needles baking in the sun. We set up camp quickly, tent staked down, firewood collected, and before long we were sitting by a crackling fire, watching the sun sink lower, painting the treetops in shades of orange and red. I remember Sarah laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes reflecting the firelight. It was the kind of moment that makes you feel alive, makes you feel like the rest of the world doesn't matter. But that was before the woods went quiet, before everything changed. The sun had dipped below the horizon, the warmth of the day fading with it, and that was when I noticed it. The woods, which had been alive with the sounds of insects and birds, had gone silent, not just quiet, but completely, unnervingly silent. I glanced over at Sarah, who was staring into the darkness, her brow furrowed. "And did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing. "Hear what?" "Exactly," I said, gesturing to the woods around us. "It's too quiet." She listened for a moment, her expression shifting from confusion to unease. "Yeah, it's weird." I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself it was nothing. "Sometimes the forest just goes still," I told myself, but the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Something was wrong. The first whiff of the smell hit me like a slap in the face. It was putrid, like a mix of decaying flesh and something else, something almost chemical, like burnt plastic. I gagged, turning away, and Sarah's nose wrinkled as she caught it too. "What the hell is that?" she asked, covering her mouth and nose with her sleeve. I shook my head. "I don't know. Maybe something died out here." I stood up, shining my flashlight towards the tree line, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing unusual. Just trees and shadows, the forest floor covered in a thick layer of pine needles. I took a few steps away from the fire, the beam bobbing ahead of me as I moved. The growl stopped me dead in my tracks. It was deep, resonant, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't like the growl of a bear or any animal I'd ever heard before. There was something almost human about it, something that made my skin crawl and my blood run cold. My hand tightened around the flashlight, and I swept the beam through the trees, my heart pounding in my ears. "Did you hear that?" I called back to Sarah, my voice shaking. "Yeah," she replied, her voice tight. She had stood up now, her eyes wide as she stared in my direction. "What was that?" I didn't have an answer. The beam of my flashlight caught a glimpse of movement, something tall, something that seemed to move between the trees faster than I could comprehend. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to understand what I was seeing. It was big, taller than any human, covered in dark fur that blended almost perfectly with the shadows of the forest. It was there, and then it wasn't, disappearing between the trees without a sound. I turned back to Sarah, my heart racing. "We need to go, now." She didn't argue. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she was already glancing at the tent, calculating how fast we could pack up. We both moved quickly, my hands trembling as I struggled to unhook the poles, the tent collapsing in a heap. The smell was still there, hanging in the air, and I could hear something moving out there, just beyond the light of the fire, circling us. Sarah's hands fumbled with the zipper on her backpack, and she let out a frustrated noise as it snagged. I moved to help her, my eyes darting to the tree line, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable, like something was right there, just out of sight, waiting. "Got it," she said, her voice trembling as she finally got the bag open, stuffing her things inside. We didn't bother packing everything. We just grabbed what we could, leaving the rest behind. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own, and I felt a chill run down my spine as we started towards the car, our flashlights bobbing in the darkness. The growl came again, closer this time, and I turned, my flashlight sweeping across the trees, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, standing between the trees, its eyes reflecting the light, glowing a dull reddish color. It was massive, its shoulders hunched, its face partially obscured by the shadows, but I could see enough. It was looking at us. Sarah grabbed my arm, pulling me. "Come on!" We ran. My feet pounded against the uneven ground, the flashlight bouncing wildly as I tried to keep it steady. I could hear Sarah's breaths, quick and panicked, as she ran beside me. The car wasn't far, but every step felt like it took an eternity, the forest stretching endlessly around us. Branches snapped behind us, heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, and I knew it was following. My legs burned, my lungs screaming for air as I pushed myself harder, my mind filled with a single thought: we had to get out of there. I could see the glint of metal up ahead, the car, just a few more steps. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat, finally managing to unlock the door. Sarah threw herself into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut, and I followed, yanking my door closed just as something heavy hit the side of the car. The whole vehicle rocked, and I let out a strangled yell, jamming the key into the ignition, my hands trembling. The engine roared to life, the headlights flickering on, illuminating the forest in front of us. For a split second, I saw it, standing there just beyond the reach of the light, its eyes glowing, its mouth twisted into something that might have been a snarl or a grin. And then it turned, disappearing into the darkness as I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning against the dirt before catching, the car lurching forward. We sped down the narrow road, the trees a blur on either side, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Neither of us spoke, the only sound the roar of the engine and our ragged breaths. It wasn't until we were miles away, the forest thinning around us, that I finally let myself breathe, my foot easing off the gas. Sarah was shaking, her eyes wide, staring out the window as if she expected to see it still following us. I reached over, my hand resting on hers, my own fingers trembling. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, and I tried to give her a reassuring smile, but I could feel the fear still twisting in my gut. We didn't stop until we were back in town, the bright lights of the gas station a welcome sight. I pulled into the parking lot, the car coming to a shuddering stop, and we just sat there for a moment, the silence heavy between us. I could still smell it, that awful rotting stench, lingering in my nose, in my clothes. Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was that?" I shook my head, my eyes staring straight ahead. The memory of those glowing eyes burned into my mind. "I don't know," I said, "but we're not going back there. Ever." She nodded, her hand tightening around mine, and we both sat there, the car idling, the lights of the gas station flickering above us. Whatever it was, whatever we had seen, it was still out there, somewhere in those woods, watching, waiting, and I knew, deep down, that we had been lucky to get away, lucky to be sitting there together. The forest was supposed to be a place of peace, of solitude. But now, all I could think of was that smell, that growl, and the way those eyes had followed us. And I knew that no matter how much time passed, no matter how far away we were, I would never forget the feeling of being hunted. Story 4. The moment I saw those eyes glowing in the darkness, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. But let me start from the beginning. It was supposed to be a simple father-daughter bonding trip. Just me, Mike Callahan, and my 15-year-old daughter Lily, spending a weekend camping in the Cascade Mountains. A chance to reconnect, to bridge the growing gap between us as she barreled headlong into those tumultuous teenage years. I should have known better than to suggest a night hike. The day had started off well enough. We'd arrived at the campground in the early afternoon, pitched our tent, and spent a few hours exploring the nearby trails. Lily had even put down her phone for a while, showing genuine interest in the local flora and fauna I pointed out. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. I had a sudden inspiration. "Hey, kiddo," I said, nudging Lily with my elbow. "What do you say we take a little night hike? The stars should be amazing up here." She looked up from her phone, eyebrow raised skeptically. "I don't know, Dad. Isn't that kind of dangerous?" I waved off her concern. "Nah, we'll stick to the main trail. I've got my headlamp, and there's a full moon tonight. It'll be an adventure." Lily shrugged, but I could see a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. "Okay, I guess, but if we get eaten by a bear, I'm totally blaming you." I laughed, ruffling her hair. "Deal. Now come on, let's grab our jackets and hit the trail." And so, armed with my trusty headlamp, a couple of water bottles, and a bag of trail mix, we set off down Whispering Pine Trail. The forest was alive with nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Lily walked close beside me, her earlier bravado fading as the shadows deepened around us. "Are you okay, sweetie?" I asked, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. She nodded, but her voice was small. "Yeah, it's just, darker than I thought it would be." I was about to suggest turning back when we rounded a bend in the trail, and the trees opened up to reveal a stunning vista. The valley stretched out below us, bathed in silvery moonlight. Above, the Milky Way arched across the sky in a dazzling river of stars. "Wow," Lily breathed, her fear forgotten. "Dad, this is incredible," I grinned, feeling a swell of pride. This was exactly what I'd hoped for, a moment of genuine connection, of shared wonder at the natural world. We stood there for a while, pointing out constellations and watching for shooting stars. It was perfect until it wasn't. The crack of a branch breaking nearby shattered the peaceful moment. Lily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What was that?" she whispered, voice trembling. I played it cool, even as my own heart rate picked up. "Probably just a deer, nothing to worry about." But then we heard it again, closer this time, and accompanied by a low, rumbling sound that was definitely not a deer. I swept my headlamp in the direction of the noise, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something large moving between the trees, something that walked on two legs. "Dad!" Lily's voice was barely audible. "What is that?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "I'm not sure, honey, but I think we should head back to camp now. Stay close to me, okay?" We turned and started back down the trail, walking as quickly as we dared in the dim light. I kept my headlamp trained on the path ahead, acutely aware of the sounds of movement in the forest around us. That's when I saw them. Two glowing eyes, reflecting the light of my headlamp. They were at least 7 feet off the ground, set in a massive, shadowy form. Lily saw them too. She let out a strangled gasp, clutching my arm even tighter. "Run," I whispered, giving her a gentle push. Back to the camp. Now! We took off down the trail, our feet pounding against the dirt. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, branches snapping as something large crashed through the underbrush. Lily stumbled, and I caught her arm, yanking her back to her feet. "Keep going," I shouted, risking a glance over my shoulder. What I saw nearly stopped me in my tracks. The creature was gaining on us, moving with impossible speed for something so large. In the fleeting glimpses I caught as my headlamp bobbed, I could make out a hulking, fur-covered form. Not a bear. Not anything I recognized. We burst out of the tree line into the campground, sprinting toward our car. I fumbled for the keys in my pocket, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the unlock button. "Get in!" I yelled, practically shoving Lily into the passenger seat before diving behind the wheel. As I jammed the key into the ignition, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. The creature had emerged from the woods, its massive silhouette visible in the moonlight. It stood upright, easily 8 feet tall, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. And it was coming straight for us. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the gravel. As we fishtailed onto the main road, I caught one last glimpse of the thing in my rearview mirror. It stood at the edge of the campground, watching us go. Then it melted back into the shadows of the forest. We drove in silence for several miles, both of us too shaken to speak. Finally, Lily turned to me, her face pale in the dashboard lights. "Dad," she said, her voice quavering. What was that thing?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. "I don't know, sweetheart. I really don't know. It looked like... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Like something that shouldn't exist. I finished for her. She nodded, hugging herself tightly. "Are we going to tell anyone?" I considered this for a moment. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of town, dismissed as hysterical campers who got spooked by shadows and an overactive imagination. "Let's keep this between us for now," I said finally. "At least until we figure out what to do." Lily was quiet for a long time after that. As we neared the outskirts of our town, she spoke up again. "Dad, can we not go camping for a while?" Despite everything, I couldn't help but chuckle. "Yeah, kiddo. I think we can manage that." We pulled into our driveway, just as the first hints of dawn were lightening the sky. As we got out of the car, Lily surprised me by wrapping her arms around me in a fierce hug. "Thanks for protecting me, Dad," she mumbled into my chest. I held her tight, feeling a surge of love and protectiveness. "Always, sweetheart, always." As we headed inside, both exhausted and still on edge, I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes in the darkness. Whatever we'd encountered out there in the woods, it had changed something fundamental in how I viewed the world. The comfortable certainties I'd always relied on had been shaken to their core. I knew we'd have to deal with what happened eventually, report it to the authorities maybe. But for now, all I wanted was to hold my daughter close and pretend, just for a little while, that the monsters in the dark were nothing more than campfire stories. But deep down, I knew the truth. There are things out there in the wilderness, in the shadowy places between civilization and untamed nature, that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our technology and progress, we're still just fragile creatures in a world full of mysteries and dangers we can't begin to comprehend. As I finally drifted off to sleep, one thought kept circling in my mind. Next time Lily wants to go to the mall for some father-daughter bonding, I'm not going to argue. Sometimes the most mundane options are the safest ones, and after what we'd seen, safe sounded pretty damn good to me. Story 5. The fog came down on the mountain like a blanket, thick and suffocating. It was sudden. One moment I was standing on the trail, taking in the sweeping view of the valley below, and the next, everything was swallowed by a milky white haze. I could hardly see my own hand in front of my face, and that's when I saw them, the footprints, huge, fresh and leading straight into the fog. I had planned this hike for weeks. The weather forecast had promised clear skies and perfect visibility, and I was eager for some solitude after a long week in the city. I'd left the parking lot at dawn, the chill of early morning still hanging in the air, my breath forming small clouds in front of me. The trail was well-worn, familiar, one I'd taken many times before, but today I wanted to push further, to reach a clearing I'd only heard about, a hidden gem at the top of the mountain. The climb had been steady, my boots crunching over the gravel path as the sun slowly began to rise, bathing the landscape in a soft golden light. There was nothing but the rustle of wind through the trees, the occasional call of a bird, and my own footsteps, the kind of quiet that let me truly breathe. I had almost reached the ridge when the fog rolled in, without warning, like something alive. It was strange how fast it happened. One moment clear blue sky, the next a dense wall of white. I stopped, squinting into the fog, trying to gauge how far I'd gone. It was unsettling how quickly I lost my bearings. The trees around me faded to silhouettes, barely visible through the thick mist. I could no longer see the path ahead or behind. Everything was muted, the sounds of the forest muffled, as though the fog had swallowed not just the light but the very world around me. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were just an odd pattern in the dirt, maybe left by water running down the slope or some trick of the fog that made shadows seem like shapes. But when I knelt down, I saw them clearly. Large, deep impressions, bigger than any footprint I'd ever seen. They were unmistakable, with clear indentations of toes and an arch that was far too human-like for comfort, but easily twice the size of my boot. My stomach dropped. I'd heard the stories, of course, the campfire tales people told to spook each other out here, whispers of something big and hairy, a shadow that moved through the forest, always just out of sight. But those were just stories, the kind that got exaggerated over time until they were unrecognizable from whatever kernel of truth might have started them. And yet, here were the tracks, leading off into the fog, each one perfectly outlined in the damp earth. I rose slowly, my eyes following the path of the footprints as they disappeared into the white haze ahead of me. Part of me wanted to turn back right then, to retrace my steps, to get back to the safety of my jeep and forget I'd ever seen anything. But there was another part of me, a stronger part, that needed to know. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and then I started to follow them. The air was cold, the fog clinging to my skin, my clothes, until I felt like I was walking through water. Each step felt heavier than the last, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. My eyes were fixed on the ground, following those prints, my heartbeat pounding steadily in my ears. The tracks led me off the trail, winding between the trees, up a slight incline, until I found myself standing in a small clearing. It was then that I realized how quiet it had become. Not just the usual stillness of the woods, but an absence of all sound. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant bird calls, just silence, thick and oppressive. I shivered, my breath visible in front of me, the fog swirling around my head like a living thing. In the clearing, the footprints stopped, abruptly, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished. I turned in a slow circle, the fog distorting everything around me, making shapes out of shadows. My flashlight, though it was barely midday, the fog was so thick it might as well have been night, cut a narrow beam through the haze, but it showed nothing beyond a few feet. Just more fog, more trees, more shadows, and then I heard it, a sound that sent ice down my spine. A low, guttural noise, somewhere between a growl and a rumble, vibrating through the stillness. I spun around, my flashlight jerking as I tried to pinpoint where it had come from, but it was impossible. The fog distorted everything, made the noise seem like it was coming from everywhere at once. My heart hammered in my chest, my hands beginning to shake. Another noise, this one closer, a crack like a branch snapping underfoot. My flashlight darted towards the sound, catching nothing but swirling mist. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my instincts screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet were frozen in place. I strained my ears, listening, every muscle in my body tensed. Then, just at the edge of my vision, I saw movement. A shadow, massive, shifting between the trees. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the fog. But it had been there, I was sure of it. The shape was tall, impossibly tall, its outline barely distinguishable from the trunks around it, but it moved in a way that no tree ever could. Panic surged through me, finally breaking whatever spell had kept me rooted. I turned, my feet slipping slightly on the damp ground, and I began to run. The fog made everything disorienting, the trees blurring together, the path ahead of me never quite visible until I was on it. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my lungs burning with each inhale. I could hear something behind me, not footsteps exactly, but movement, the shifting of branches, the rustle of something large pushing through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back, I just kept running, my flashlight bouncing in my hand, casting wild shadows that only heightened my fear. I stumbled over a root, nearly going down, but managed to catch myself, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The fog was relentless, the world around me reduced to nothing but vague shapes and shadows, everything seeming to shift and move as I ran past. Finally, through the haze, I caught a glimpse of something metallic. The Jeep, parked exactly where I'd left it. A sob of relief caught in my throat as I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my chest tight. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it immediately. For a moment I just sat there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my eyes wide as I stared out into the fog. It was still thick, clinging to the trees, to the car, wrapping the world in white. I couldn't see anything, no movement, no shadow, nothing to indicate that there was anything out there at all. But I knew there was. I could feel it. A presence just beyond the edge of my vision, hidden by the fog. I started the engine, the sound startlingly loud in the silence, and I turned the Jeep around, the tires slipping slightly on the damp earth before catching. I drove slowly at first, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerge from the fog, something tall and dark, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the thick, swirling mist and the empty forest beyond. It wasn't until I was halfway down the mountain, the fog beginning to thin, that I let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands were still trembling on the wheel, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I tried to make sense of what I'd seen, what I'd heard, but there was no explanation that didn't sound crazy. Footprints that big, a shadow that tall. It didn't belong in the woods. It didn't belong anywhere. By the time I reached the main road, the fog had lifted completely. The sun shining once more, the sky a brilliant blue as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. The memory of those footprints, of that shadow moving through the trees, was burned into my mind. I drove straight home, not stopping once, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting to see something there, watching. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the sun was low on the horizon, the day nearly gone. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at my hands still gripping the wheel, my knuckles white. I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the fog, my mind playing games with me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't true. I haven't been back to that mountain since. I don't think I ever will. Whatever was up there, whatever I saw, it was real. And some things, some places, are better left alone. Story 6. The first rule of wildlife photography: never become the subject. I broke that rule the night I camped in Shadow Mist Valley, and I'm still not sure I made it out alive. My name is Emily Hartley, and I've spent the last decade chasing the perfect shot of nature's most elusive creatures. From the snow leopards of the Himalayas to the giant squid of the deep ocean, I've captured images that most people only dream of seeing. But it was my obsession with an unnamed species that led me to the most terrifying night of my life. It started with whispers, really. Cryptozoology forums, buzzing with sightings of something strange in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. Grainy photos and shaky video footage that hinted at a creature unlike anything in the scientific record. Most dismissed it as a hoax, a Bigfoot wannabe for the digital age. But I saw something in those images that gnawed at me, an authenticity that I couldn't shake. So I packed my gear and headed into the wilderness, determined to be the one to finally capture indisputable proof of this mystery beast. I should have listened to the warning signs from the start. The locals in the last tiny town before the forest were tight-lipped and evasive when I asked about recent sightings. One grizzled old-timer at the general store fixed me with a steely gaze as I checked out. "You heading up to Shadow Mist, miss?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. I nodded, trying to keep my excitement in check. "Just for a few days of wildlife photography." He shook his head slowly. "Best stick to the marked trails. Some things up there don't take kindly to being seen. if you catch my meaning." I laughed it off, but his words echoed in my mind as I drove the winding road into the deepening forest. By the time I reached my designated campsite, the sun was already sinking below the tree line, painting the sky in vivid oranges and purples. I set up my tent with practiced efficiency, then got to work, placing my camera traps at strategic points around the clearing. Top-of-the-line equipment with motion sensors and night vision capabilities. If anything larger than a squirrel moved through here tonight, I'd have the footage. As true darkness fell, I retreated to my tent with a freeze-dried dinner and my laptop, reviewing the day's shots and planning tomorrow's hike. The forest around me came alive with nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Normal, natural sounds that should have been comforting, but there was something else. A stillness beneath the familiar noises, a sense of watchfulness that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I told myself it was just my imagination working overtime, fueled by local legends and my own anticipation. I must have dozed off at some point, because I jerked awake to the sound of heavy breathing just outside my tent. For a moment, I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, ears straining in the darkness. There it was again, a deep, rumbling inhalation unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Too big to be a bear, too guttural for any known predator. My heart pounding. I reached for the flashlight beside me. Whatever was out there, I needed to see it. But as my fingers closed around the cold metal, a low growl vibrated through the air, a warning. I lay there, barely breathing, as something massive circled my tent. The ground trembled slightly with each step. I could hear branches snapping, fabric rustling as it investigated my equipment. A whimper escaped my throat as I imagined those camera traps being crushed, my chance at documentation slipping away. Then, silence. Had it left? I waited, counting my heartbeats, before slowly unzipping the tent flap. The moonlight spilled in, illuminating nothing. The clearing was empty, but as I crawled out, my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth, was a footprint, huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear toe impressions and wickedly curved claw marks at the tips. I fumbled for my camera, hands shaking as I snapped photo after photo, desperate to preserve the evidence before it could be lost. As the first pink tendrils of dawn crept across the sky, I began breaking down my campsite. Every snapping twig made me flinch, every shadow seemed to move. I was running on adrenaline and fear, my mind racing with possibilities. What had I encountered? Was it still out there, watching? I was so focused on packing up that I almost missed it. A tuft of coarse, dark hair snagged on a branch at the edge of the clearing. With trembling fingers, I carefully placed it in a small evidence bag, another piece of the puzzle. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, jumping at every movement in my peripheral vision. It wasn't until I was safely back in my small apartment, doors locked and blinds drawn, that I allowed myself to really process what had happened. I spent hours poring over the photos and samples, comparing them to known species, searching for any rational explanation. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. Whatever I had encountered in those woods was something science had yet to classify, something that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. The question now was what to do with this information. Going public would invite ridicule from the scientific community, maybe even end my career. But keeping it to myself felt like a betrayal of everything I stood for as a documentary photographer. In the end, I decided to bide my time. I needed more evidence, more concrete proof before I could present my findings to the world, and that meant going back. It took me weeks to work up the courage. I upgraded my equipment, invested in some more serious protective gear. I told myself I was being cautious, prepared, but deep down I knew I was just delaying the inevitable confrontation with something beyond my understanding. The night before my return trip, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The memory of that breathing outside my tent, the weight of that unseen presence, haunted me. Was I really ready to face it again? But I knew I had no choice. Whatever was out there in Shadowmist Valley, it had awoken something in me, a primal curiosity that wouldn't be satisfied until I had answers, or until those answers found me. As I packed my bags, I couldn't shake the feeling that this time I was the one being hunted, that somehow the tables had turned and I had become the subject of some greater, more terrifying study. I thought back to that grizzled old man in the general store, his cryptic warning. "Some things up there don't take kindly to being seen," he had said. As I locked my apartment door and headed for my car, those words echoed in my mind. What if, in my quest to uncover the truth, I had attracted the attention of something that preferred to remain hidden? What if, by piercing the veil between the known and unknown, I had set in motion events I couldn't control? These questions swirled in my mind as I drove towards the mountains, the familiar scenery giving way to dense forest. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white with determination and fear. Whatever awaited me in Shadowmist Valley, I was going to face it head-on. I was going to get my answers, no matter the cost. Because that's what I do. I shed light on the world's mysteries, even if it means stepping into the darkest shadows. As I turned onto the winding road that would take me deep into the heart of the forest, I couldn't shake one final, chilling thought. What if, this time, the unseen watcher decided it was tired of remaining unseen? The trees closed in around me, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, I knew something was waiting, and this time I wasn't sure if I was the hunter or the hunted, but I was going to find out, one way or another. Story 7. The first scream sounded like it was coming from deep in the woods, distant but unmistakably human. It cut through the quiet of our campsite, making me freeze mid-sentence. My brother Jake and I exchanged a glance, his expression a mix of confusion and alarm, mirroring my own. No one else was supposed to be out here. Jake and I had decided to spend a long weekend camping in the backcountry, far away from the usual crowded trails and noisy campgrounds. We were looking for solitude, a place where we could hike all day and relax by the fire at night without seeing another soul. The map had shown a promising spot, a small clearing, miles away from any official trail, perfect for an escape from the world. We arrived late in the afternoon, and the setting was even better than we had hoped. Dense woods surrounded us on all sides, the clearing itself dotted with wildflowers. We set up camp quickly, tent, firewood, gear all ready, and soon we had a fire crackling, our small lanterns casting a warm glow as the sun dipped below the trees. It was just after sunset when we first heard it, the scream. It was a high-pitched, desperate sound, echoing through the trees, fading out in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My first thought was that it was an animal, but there was something too human about it, something that made my chest tighten. Jake frowned, turning his head in the direction of the sound. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I replied, my own voice wavering. I looked out towards the forest, but all I could see was darkness, the trees fading into blackness under the night sky. "Maybe it's just someone playing a prank." Jake shook his head slowly. "Who would be out here? We're miles from anywhere." He was right. We hadn't seen a single person all day. No cars parked at the trailhead, no hikers on the unmarked path we had followed. This was supposed to be our own little slice of wilderness. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling, the sound of the scream still echoing in my head. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, an animal, a trick of the wind, maybe even a dream I'd had while dozing by the fire. But deep down, I knew it was real. And then we heard it again. This time, it was closer, louder. The scream seemed to come from somewhere just beyond the edge of our clearing, a voice calling for help, a voice that sounded eerily familiar. My stomach clenched, a cold knot of fear forming as I listened. "Help me!" The voice was unmistakable. It was my voice. Jake and I exchanged a look, his eyes wide with disbelief. That sounded like you," he said, his voice trembling. I nodded, my heart pounding, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd heard. It didn't make any sense. There was no one else out here, no one who could possibly imitate my voice so perfectly. And yet, there it was, a desperate plea, echoing through the trees, calling for help in my own voice. Jake stood up, grabbing the flashlight from beside his chair. "We need to check it out," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "Are you serious?" I asked, my own fear making my voice sound higher than I'd intended. What if it's... I didn't know how to finish that sentence. What if it's what? A trick, a ghost, something worse. Jake ignored me, clicking on the flashlight and pointing it towards the dark line of trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the pines, the underbrush casting long, dancing shadows. He took a step forward, and I stood up, my gut screaming at me not to let him go out there alone. "Fine," I said, grabbing my own flashlight, "but we stay close." We stepped away from the fire, the light of our camp fading behind us as we moved towards the woods. The air felt colder the moment we left the clearing, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand shook, the light bobbing over branches and roots, casting strange, twisting shapes against the trees. "Hello?" Jake called, his voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" There was no answer. Just the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze, the crunch of our boots on the forest floor. We moved further in, the clearing now just a dim glow behind us, the trees thickening around us, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the sky. Then we heard it again. "Help me!" The voice was farther away now, deeper in the woods, still unmistakably mine. My stomach lurched, and I felt bile rise in my throat. It was as if whatever was out there was leading us further in, drawing us away from the safety of our camp. "This doesn't feel right," I whispered, glancing at Jake. His face was pale, his jaw set, but he nodded in agreement. Let's go back," he said, his voice barely audible. We turned, the forest around us suddenly feeling more oppressive, the shadows deeper. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my entire body tense, every instinct screaming at me to run. We moved quickly, our footsteps crunching loudly in the silence, the glow of our campfire a beacon up ahead. But before we could reach it, the voice called out again, closer this time, from somewhere off to our left. "Help me!" It was desperate, pleading, the exact way I would call out if I were in danger. I couldn't help it. I turned, my flashlight beam swinging towards the sound, my breath catching in my chest. For just a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure, tall and shadowy, standing between the trees. Its eyes reflected the light, two pinpoints of brightness in the darkness. I blinked, and it was gone, the forest empty once more. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "See what?" Jake asked, his own flashlight darting in the same direction. I don't know," I said, my heart pounding. I think we need to get out of here." "Now," Jake didn't argue. We turned and practically ran back to the camp, the fire crackling as we burst into the clearing, the warmth and light a welcome relief from the cold darkness of the woods. I dropped down next to the fire, my hands trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Jake stood by the edge of the clearing, his flashlight still pointed towards the trees. Do you think it was someone messing with us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, staring into the flames. "I don't know," I said, "but whatever it was, it knew my voice. It was trying to get us to follow it." Jake sat down across from me, his eyes wide, his face pale in the firelight. We didn't say anything else. We just sat there, staring at the fire, listening to the silence of the forest around us. The rest of the night passed in uneasy quiet. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump, my eyes darting towards the trees, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But nothing came. The voice didn't call out again, and eventually the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the darkness slowly retreating. We packed up as soon as it was light enough to see, neither of us speaking much, the weight of the night hanging heavy between us. We left the clearing, our gear hastily thrown into our packs, the fire extinguished, the forest once again coming alive with the sounds of morning, birds singing, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was almost like the night before had never happened, but I knew better. I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. And as we made our way back to the trailhead, the dense forest surrounding us on all sides, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting, something that knew my voice, something that wanted us to follow. Jake glanced at me as we walked, his eyes tired, a question on his lips that he didn't need to ask. I just shook my head, my gaze fixed on the trail ahead. We weren't going to talk about it, not now, maybe not ever. Some things, I decided, were better left in the dark. When we finally reached the car, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of relief that I hadn't realized I was holding on to. We tossed our packs into the trunk, climbed in, and drove away, the forest slowly receding in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. As we left the woods behind, I tried to tell myself it was over, that whatever had happened out there was behind us now. But deep down, I knew that voice would stay with me, the sound of my own words, twisted and wrong, echoing through the trees, calling me deeper into the dark. Story 8. I've been a hunter for 30 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night in the Blackwood Forest. It was supposed to be a routine tracking job, just me and the wilderness. Instead, I found myself face to face with something that shook my understanding of the natural world to its core. My name is John Hawkins, and I've spent most of my life in these woods. I know every trail, every ridge, every hidden glen, or at least I thought I did. That crisp October evening changed everything. It started simply enough. I'd been hired by a local rancher to track down whatever had been killing his cattle. Mountain lion was my first guess. Maybe a bear, but the claw marks I'd seen on the carcasses didn't quite match up. They were too big, too savage. Still, I figured it was just an unusually large predator, nothing I couldn't handle. I set out just before dusk, my trusty rifle slung over my shoulder and a pack full of supplies on my back. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. A hunter's moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The first few hours were uneventful. I followed a game trail deep into the heart of the forest, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of large predator activity. As the night wore on, I began to pick up a trail, broken branches, tufts of fur caught on thorns, and tracks unlike any I'd seen before. They were huge, easily twice the size of a bear's paw print, with clear claw marks at the tips. But the shape was all wrong. Too elongated, almost human-like, but massively oversized. A chill ran down my spine as I crouched to examine them more closely. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a sound I recognized. Not bear, not mountain lion, not anything I'd encountered in 3 decades of hunting. I stood slowly, my hand instinctively moving to the rifle at my side. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if every living creature was holding its breath. In the silvery moonlight, shadows seemed to shift and move between the trees. Hello, I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. Anyone out there? No response, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hunted. I decided to push on. following the strange tracks deeper into a part of the forest I'd rarely explored. The undergrowth grew thicker, the trees pressing in close on either side. More than once, I had to backtrack and find a new route around fallen logs or dense thickets. As I rounded a large boulder, I came to an abrupt halt. There, in a small clearing, lay the partially devoured carcass of a deer. But it wasn't the dead animal that made my blood run cold. It was the claw marks on the nearby trees. Long, deep gouges ran up the trunks, far higher than any bear could reach. Some were so deep I could see the pale wood beneath the bark. Whatever had done this was incredibly powerful and incredibly large. I approached one of the trees, running my hand over the rough marks. They were fresh, couldn't be more than a few hours old, which meant whatever had made them might still be nearby. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, bringing my rifle up in one smooth motion. But there was nothing there, just shadows and moonlight playing tricks on my eyes, or so I thought. As I lowered my gun, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. Something massive, moving with impossible speed and silence for its size, darting between the trees. My heart pounding, I brought the rifle back up to my shoulder, scanning the tree line. "Show yourself," I shouted, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, a shape began to emerge from the shadows. At first, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but as it moved into the moonlit clearing, I realized how terribly wrong I was. The creature before me stood easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were unnaturally long, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws, but it was the face that truly terrified me. A twisted amalgamation of wolf and man, with glowing yellow eyes that fixed on me with terrifying intelligence. I stood frozen, my finger on the trigger, as the beast regarded me. It let out a low, rumbling growl, the same sound I'd heard earlier. Up close, it vibrated through my entire body, setting my teeth on edge. Time seemed to stretch as we faced each other down. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This thing, whatever it was, shouldn't exist. It was like something out of a nightmare or an old campfire tale. Slowly, almost casually, the creature took a step forward. Its muscles rippled beneath its fur, raw power evident in every movement. I knew, with absolute certainty, that my rifle would be useless against this beast. If it decided to attack, I was as good as dead. "Oh, easy now," I found myself saying, as if I were talking to a spooked horse instead of an impossible monster. "I don't want any trouble." To my utter shock, the creature paused. Its head tilted slightly, as if considering my words. For a brief, wild moment, I wondered if it could understand me. That's when I made my mistake. Slowly, I began to lower my rifle, hoping to appear less threatening. But as soon as the barrel dipped, the creature's demeanor changed. A snarl ripped from its throat, and it lunged forward with frightening speed. I didn't think, I just reacted. I fired off 2 quick shots and dove to the side, rolling behind the cover of a fallen log. The creature's roar of pain and rage filled the clearing, drowning out the echoes of my gunshots. Breathing hard, I peered over the log. The beast was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear it crashing through the underbrush nearby. Dark, viscous blood stained the forest floor where it had stood. I'd hit it, but I knew it wasn't enough. This thing, whatever it was, could take a lot more punishment than any normal animal. For hours, I played a terrifying game of cat and mouse through the darkened forest. Sometimes I was the hunter, tracking the blood trail and listening for movement. Other times, I was acutely aware that I was the prey, feeling those yellow eyes burning into my back as I moved from cover to cover. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I found myself back at the edge of familiar territory. My truck was parked just beyond the tree line, safety tantalizingly close, but between me and escape stood the creature. It was wounded, one arm hanging limp at its side, but still very much alive and very, very angry, its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. I raised my rifle one last time, knowing I had only 2 shots left. "Come on then," I muttered. "Let's finish this." The beast charged, covering the distance between us in a heartbeat. I fired both rounds, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the creature's fierce visage. It stumbled, roaring in pain and fury, but didn't go down. I closed my eyes, certain these were my last moments. But the killing blow never came. Instead, I heard a whimper, followed by the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. A trail of blood led off into the dense forest, quickly swallowed up by the shadows. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I ran for my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped down the mountain road, my mind raced with questions. What was that thing? How many more were out there? And most importantly, who would believe me? In the end, I decided to keep quiet about what I'd seen. I told the rancher I'd tracked the predator but lost it in the deep woods. Let him think it was just an unusually large bear or mountain lion. The truth was too fantastic, too terrifying to share. But I know what's out there now. I've seen the impossible with my own eyes, felt the primal fear of being hunted by something that should not exist. And I know that I'm no longer at the top of the food chain. These days, I stick to the well-traveled paths and never venture into the deep woods alone, because out there, in the shadows of the ancient forest, something is waiting. Something that reminds us that there are still mysteries in this world and dangers beyond our comprehension. And sometimes, the hunter can all too easily become the hunted. Story 9. It happened on a desolate road, the kind that stretched for miles without a sign of life, where the darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond the beams of your headlights. I just crested a hill, the forest rising up on either side, when something moved, a shadow, large and swift, crossing the road in a blink. My heart lurched, and I slammed on the brakes, tires squealing as the car shuddered to a stop. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and my own panicked breathing, and then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that made the hair on my neck stand on end. It had been a long day, one that had started before the sun had even risen and dragged on far longer than I had planned. I'd been working out of town, a good 3 hours from home, and by the time I finally wrapped everything up, the night had already set in a deep and starless black. There was no choice but to make the drive back. I wanted my own bed, not some cheap motel mattress. The road was an old state highway, a narrow 2-lane stretch that cut through miles of forest and farmland. The kind of road where you could go 20 minutes without seeing another car. My headlights were the only thing keeping the dark at bay. The radio nothing but a faint background noise to fill the emptiness. I was tired, my eyes heavy, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly to keep myself alert. I crested a hill, the car rumbling over the uneven pavement, when I saw it, a flash of movement, a shadow darting across the road so fast that my mind barely had time to register it before my body reacted. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly, my heart hammering in my chest. The tires squealed, and I felt the car lurch to a stop, the headlights casting a stark cone of light across the asphalt, illuminating nothing but the empty road. My breath caught in my throat, and I stared out into the darkness, my heart pounding as I tried to understand what I'd just seen. It had been big, whatever it was, tall, almost humanoid, but with an animalistic grace that sent a shiver through me. A deer, I told myself, though I knew it wasn't. It moved wrong, too fast, too fluid, and there had been something about the shape, the way it hunched over as it ran, that didn't fit any animal I knew. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and slowly eased off the brake, my hands trembling as I started to roll forward again. The road ahead was empty, the forest on either side a wall of darkness, the branches overhanging, creating a tunnel that my headlights barely seemed to penetrate. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that I was tired and seeing things. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere to my left, just beyond the reach of my headlights. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned my head, squinting into the darkness, my hands tightening on the wheel. There was nothing there, just shadows, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze, their branches whispering against each other. But the growl had been real, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest, primal and threatening. I pressed down on the accelerator, the car picking up speed, my eyes darting between the road and the forest, every shadow seeming to shift and move as I passed. The growl echoed in my mind, a reminder that something was out there, something that shouldn't be. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to focus on the road, to just get home. But the fear was a tight knot in my stomach, growing with every passing second. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, some dark shape running along the road, keeping pace with the car. But there was nothing, just the empty road, the red glow of my taillights fading into the darkness. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, my fingers aching from how tightly I was gripping the wheel. Just as I began to think that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe it really had just been an animal, a bear, perhaps, or some other creature that had wandered too close to the road, something slammed into the side of the car. The impact was sudden and violent, the whole vehicle lurching to the right, my shoulder slamming into the door. I let out a yell, my foot hitting the brake, the car skidding to a stop once more, my heart racing. For a moment, everything was still. The car idled, the headlights casting their pale light onto the road ahead, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I knew I shouldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in the car, to drive away, to get as far from this place as possible, but I had to see, I had to know what had hit me. Slowly, I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in the silence. The cool night air rushed in, and I shivered, stepping out of the car, my feet unsteady on the gravel shoulder. The forest loomed around me, a wall of darkness, my headlights barely cutting into the thick shadows. I moved around to the passenger side, my heart pounding, every muscle in my body tense. There, in the faint glow of the headlights, I saw it, a deep dent in the side of the car. The metal crumpled as though something massive had slammed into it. My breath caught in my throat, my eyes scanning the forest, the darkness beyond the road. And that's when I saw them, eyes reflecting the light, glowing faintly in the shadows. They were high off the ground, too high for any animal I knew, and they stared at me, unblinking. My heart pounded, and I took a step back, my hands trembling. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just watched me, a low growl rumbling from somewhere deep in the darkness, a sound that seemed to reverberate through my bones. I turned and ran, throwing myself back into the car, slamming the door shut, my fingers fumbling for the lock. The engine roared as I pressed down on the gas, the tires spinning on the loose gravel before finding traction, the car lurching forward. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The road stretched out ahead of me, the headlights illuminating the narrow strip of asphalt, the forest closing in on either side. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see those eyes, that shadow, something chasing after me. But there was nothing, just the empty road, the dark, endless trees. I drove for miles, my hands gripping the wheel, my eyes darting from the road to the mirrors, every shadow, every movement making my heart jump. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of town, the lights of buildings appearing in the distance, that I finally let myself breathe, the tightness in my chest easing slightly. I pulled into a gas station. The bright fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the darkness of the road behind me. I parked the car, my hands still trembling as I turned off the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring out the windshield, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look at the side of the car, didn't want to see the dent, the evidence that something real had been out there. But I had to know. I climbed out, moving slowly, my legs feeling like they might give out at any moment, and walked around to the passenger side. The dent was there, deep and unmistakable, the metal twisted as though something had hit it with incredible force. My breath caught in my throat, and I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal, the reality of it sending a shiver through me. Whatever it had been, it was real. It wasn't just my imagination, wasn't just a trick of the light or a figment of my exhaustion. I looked out towards the dark road. The forest, now just a distant line of shadows beyond the gas station lights. I could still feel it, the presence, the weight of those eyes watching me, the growl that had seemed to shake the very air around me. I knew I would never forget it, that no matter how much time passed, I would always remember that moment, standing on a dark road with something lurking just beyond the light. I climbed back into the car, my hands still shaking as I started the engine, the lights of the gas station flickering above me. I drove away, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, the dark line of the forest fading into the distance behind me. And even though I knew I was leaving it behind, that whatever had been out there was far away now, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, still waiting, somewhere in the darkness. I never took that road again. No matter how much time I saved, no matter how convenient it might have been, I found another route, one that kept me far away from those woods, because some things, some shadows, are better left in the dark. Story 10. I've always prided myself on being prepared for anything, but nothing could have readied me for that night in Whisper Woods, when the line between reality and nightmare blurred into a terrifying haze. My name is Lisa, and what was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway with my boyfriend Mark turned into a fight for survival against something we still can't explain. It started innocently enough. Mark and I had been dating for about a year, and we decided to celebrate our anniversary with a camping trip. We're both pretty outdoorsy, so the idea of spending a few days hiking and stargazing in the remote Whisper Woods seemed perfect. We arrived at the trailhead late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping low on the horizon. The park ranger gave us a friendly wave as we signed in, but I caught a flicker of something in his eyes when we mentioned our planned route. "You folks be careful out there," he said, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of tension. "Stick to the marked trails and make sure you're back before dark each day. These woods can get a bit tricky after nightfall." I laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to the usual warnings given to city folks venturing into the wilderness. If only I'd paid more attention. The first day and a half were wonderful. Mark and I hiked through breathtaking scenery, marveling at towering redwoods and crystal-clear streams. We set up camp in a picturesque clearing, roasted marshmallows over the fire, and fell asleep to the gentle sounds of the forest. It was on the second day that things went wrong. We decided to take a more challenging trail, one that promised stunning views from a nearby ridge. But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear we had somehow strayed from the path. "I don't understand," Mark muttered, squinting at our map. "We should have reached the lookout point by now." I peered over his shoulder, an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. The landmarks around us didn't match anything on the map. It was as if we had wandered into a completely different part of the forest. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested, glancing at the darkening sky. "We can try again tomorrow." Mark nodded, but as we turned to retrace our steps, nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches casting strange, shifting shadows in the fading light. We walked for what felt like hours, each step taking us deeper into unknown territory. The sun had long since disappeared behind the mountains, leaving us in a twilight gloom that made every tree look the same. "This is impossible," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We can't have gone that far off trail." Mark put an arm around me, but I could feel the tension in his body. "It's okay. We'll just..." We'll just make camp here for the night. Everything will look clearer in the morning. We found a small clearing and hurriedly set up our tent as true darkness fell. The forest around us came alive with nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but there was something else too. A stillness that felt unnatural, as if the woods were holding their breath. We huddled in our sleeping bags, two on edge to consider sleep. Mark kept his flashlight on, the beam cutting a small circle of light in the oppressive darkness. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, sitting up suddenly. Mark tensed beside me. "Hear what?" I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound that had startled me. There it was again, a soft cracking noise, like someone stepping on a dry twig. And it was close. "Giant goose, there's something out there," I breathed, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever it was could hear it. Mark unzipped the tent flap a fraction, peering out into the night. "I don't see any—" His words cut off abruptly as a low, rumbling growl vibrated through the air. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not quite bear, not quite wolf, but somehow more primal and terrifying than both combined. We froze, barely daring to breathe. The growl came again, closer this time. And then, in the beam of Mark's flashlight, we saw it. A massive, fur-covered arm reached into view, ending in a hand-like appendage with wickedly curved claws. It was easily twice the size of a human hand, and as it grasped at our backpack lying just outside the tent, I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. Mark moved with agonizing slowness, reaching for the hunting knife he kept in his boot. But as his fingers closed around the handle, a twig snapped under his shifting weight. The creature outside went still. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it whirled toward our tent. In the flashlight's glow, I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes and a muzzle filled with razor-sharp teeth. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. A nightmarish blend of bear and wolf, standing upright on two legs. Time seemed to stretch as we stared at each other through the thin fabric of the tent. I could hear its heavy breathing, feel the weight of its gaze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This thing shouldn't exist. It was impossible. And yet there it was, barely 3 feet away from us. Mark's hand tightened on the knife. "When I say run," he whispered, so quietly I could barely hear him. "Head for the trees. Don't look back. Just run." I wanted to argue, to tell him it was suicide to face this thing, but before I could speak, the creature let out an ear-splitting roar and lunged at the tent. "Run!" Mark shouted, slashing at the fabric with his knife. We burst out of the collapsing tent, adrenaline coursing through our veins. I sprinted for the tree line, branches whipping at my face as I plunged into the darkness. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of a struggle. Mark's shouts mixed with inhuman snarls and the ripping of fabric. Every instinct screamed at me to keep running, to get as far away as possible, but I couldn't leave Mark. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving as I tried to quiet my breathing and listen. For a moment, there was nothing but the pounding of my own heart. Then I heard it, labored breathing and the snap of twigs underfoot. Something was coming my way. I pressed myself against a tree trunk, willing myself to blend into the shadows. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a low, pained groan. Human. Mark. "Lisa!" he called out weakly. "Lisa, where are you?" I sagged with relief, stepping out from my hiding place. "Mark! I'm here! The words died in my throat as the beam of my flashlight fell on him. Mark was covered in blood, deep gashes running across his chest and arms, but it was his eyes that terrified me, wild and feral, with a yellowish glow that hadn't been there before. "Run!" he growled, his voice distorted and barely recognizable. "Run, before I—" He doubled over with a cry of pain that turned into a snarl. Before my horrified eyes, I watched as Mark's body began to change. Bones cracked and reformed, fur sprouted from his skin, his face elongating into a bestial muzzle. I ran. Blind with terror, I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear the sound of pursuit, heavy footfalls and animalistic growls that grew closer with each passing second. I don't know how long I ran, or how I eventually found my way back to civilization. The rest of that night is a blur of panic and exhaustion. When I finally stumbled onto a road and flagged down a passing car, I was barely coherent. The official report says that Mark and I got separated in the woods, and that he's still missing. Search parties combed Whisper Woods for weeks, but found no trace of him or our campsite. As for my wild stories about monsters and men turning into beasts, they chalked it up to dehydration and trauma. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there, hiding in the depths of those ancient forests, and I know that somewhere in Whisper Woods, something that used to be Mark is still roaming. These days, I stick to the city, where the only monsters are the humankind. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I swear I can hear a distant howl carried on the wind. And I wonder how many other hikers have wandered off the trail in Whisper Woods, never to return as themselves. So if you ever find yourself in those remote mountains, heed the ranger's warning. Stick to the marked paths and make sure you're back before nightfall. Because in Whisper Woods, the line between man and beast is thinner than you could ever imagine. And once it's crossed, there's no coming back. Story 11. The sound of something scratching against the canvas of our tent woke me up in the dead of night. It wasn't the soft rustle of a branch brushing against fabric. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like claws being dragged slowly, purposefully. I held my breath, my eyes wide open in the dark, straining to hear past the rapid pounding of my heartbeat. Whatever was outside, it wasn't just passing by, it was lingering, and it wanted us to know. This was supposed to be a weekend away from it all. My friends and I had planned the trip as a chance to escape the stresses of work and life in the city. Just 3 of us, a few tents, and miles of wilderness. We'd found the perfect spot deep in the national forest, well off the beaten path, and after a full day of hiking, we set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. We laughed, cooked over an open fire, and shared stories until exhaustion finally set in and we retreated to our tents. I was sharing a tent with Paul, and Eric had his own setup a few yards away. We'd all fallen asleep quickly, the quiet of the forest wrapping around us like a warm blanket, the occasional crackle of the dying campfire and the gentle rustling of leaves lulling us into slumber. But sometime in the early hours, everything changed. The sound woke me, a scratching, faint at first, but growing louder and more insistent. I opened my eyes, my brain still clouded by sleep, unsure if I was dreaming. I could hear Paul breathing heavily beside me, still deep in sleep. For a moment, I wanted to just close my eyes, ignore it, convince myself it was nothing. But the scratching continued, more deliberate now, as if whatever it was wanted my attention. Slowly, I turned my head towards the sound, my eyes fixed on the side of the tent where the fabric shivered with each scrape. My heart began to pound, my throat tightening as I listened. It wasn't the kind of sound that a branch or an animal just passing by would make. It was too consistent, too precise. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else, any other noise that would tell me what was out there. And then I heard it, a low, guttural breathing just outside the tent, heavy and slow. My stomach twisted into a knot, and I felt my entire body tense, my mind racing. My first thought was a bear, but the way it moved, the pacing of the scratching, it didn't fit. It was almost like something with hands. I nudged Paul, my hands shaking as I reached out in the dark. He groaned softly, rolling over, his eyes blinking open groggily. "What?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. I pressed my finger to my lips, motioning for him to be quiet. He frowned, but then his eyes widened as he heard it too, the scratching, the breathing. His gaze flickered to the side of the tent, the color draining from his face. He mouthed something I couldn't quite make out, his eyes wide with fear. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag. My hand closed around it, and I held it up, pausing for a moment. Part of me didn't want to turn it on, didn't want to see whatever was out there, but I needed to. I needed to know. With a quick breath, I clicked the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent and casting a faint glow through the fabric. The scratching stopped instantly, the sudden silence more terrifying than the noise had been. Paul and I exchanged a glance, both of us holding our breath, listening. "Eric?" Paul whispered, his voice barely audible. "Maybe it's Eric messing with us?" I shook my head, my eyes fixed on the side of the tent. Eric wasn't the kind of guy who would pull a prank like this. Not in the middle of the night, not out here. And even if he had been, there was no mistaking the sound of that breathing, deep, almost animalistic, but with something unsettlingly human about it. Suddenly, from Eric's tent, we heard him shout. It wasn't a word, more of a startled yell, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing against fabric. Paul and I froze, our eyes widening in horror. The sound of Eric's shout echoed through the clearing, and then there was nothing but silence again. "Eric!" Paul hissed, louder this time, his voice shaking. No response. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, my mind racing with possibilities. What was happening? What was out there? I shone the flashlight towards the tent flap, my hand trembling. We had to go out there. We had to check on Eric. Paul grabbed my arm, his eyes wide. "Are you crazy?" he whispered. What if it's still out there?" I swallowed hard, fear clawing at my insides, but I knew we couldn't just stay in the tent. We had to do something. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, the sound of the zipper impossibly loud in the silence. The cold night air rushed in, and I shivered, stepping out onto the damp ground, the flashlight beam sweeping across the clearing. Eric's tent was still standing, the flap closed, but there was something wrong. The side of the tent looked dented, like something had slammed against it, and there were deep scratches in the fabric, long tears that hadn't been there before. My stomach lurched, and I took a hesitant step forward, my breath catching in my throat. "Eric!" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I took another step, the flashlight beam trembling as I moved closer, Paul right behind me. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the tent flap, and I hesitated, my heart pounding. Then, with a deep breath, I pulled it open. The tent was empty. Eric's sleeping bag was there, his gear, everything, but no sign of him. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, the fear tightening in my chest until it felt like I couldn't breathe. Where could he have gone? There was no way he would have just wandered off, not in the middle of the night, not without saying something. Paul let out a shaky breath, his eyes darting around the clearing. "We have to find him," he said, his voice trembling. "He can't be far." I nodded, though every part of me wanted to just get out of there, to run back to the car and leave the forest behind. But we couldn't leave Eric. We started towards the edge of the clearing, the flashlight beam bobbing as we moved, the trees looming like dark sentinels around us. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that felt wrong, oppressive. My ears strained for any sound, anything that would tell me where Eric had gone, but there was nothing, just the soft crunch of our footsteps on the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig. The beam of the flashlight swept across the ground, catching glimpses of roots, fallen branches, patches of moss. And then there, in the dirt, footprints, large, deep impressions, far bigger than any humans, leading away from the clearing, into the trees. My stomach twisted, fear gripping me as I stared at them. They weren't Eric's. They weren't ours. They were something else, something that shouldn't be here. Paul saw them too, his face going pale, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. I just knew we had to keep moving. Had to find Eric before whatever had made those prints found him. We followed the tracks, our footsteps careful, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the darkness. My heart pounded in my ears, every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch making me jump, my mind conjuring images of something lurking just beyond the light. We walked for what felt like hours, though it could have only been minutes. The forest seemed endless, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides, the cold seeping into my bones. I was starting to lose hope, my mind filled with a growing sense of dread, when we heard it. A voice, faint, somewhere up ahead. Help! It was Eric. I felt a surge of hope, my feet moving faster, Paul right behind me. Eric, I called, my voice echoing through the trees. Help me! His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough. We pushed forward, the flashlight beam bouncing, the trees seeming to shift and move around us. And then we saw him, lying on the ground, his back against a tree, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. I rushed to his side, dropping to my knees, the flashlight beam illuminating his face. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite understand. Fear, yes, but also confusion, like he couldn't believe we were really there. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head slowly, his eyes darting around, as if looking for something in the shadows. It took me," he whispered. "I don't know what it was, but it took me." A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced around, the darkness suddenly feeling thicker, more oppressive. I helped Eric to his feet, Paul standing close, his eyes scanning the trees. We needed to get out of there, now. Whatever had taken Eric, whatever had been scratching at our tent, was still out there, somewhere in the dark, watching. We moved as quickly as we could, Eric leaning heavily on me, his steps unsteady. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows shifting, the air thick with the feeling of being watched. My heart pounded, fear driving me forward, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get away. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw the clearing, the faint glow of our dying campfire, a beacon in the darkness. We stumbled into the light, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, and I felt a surge of relief, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. We didn't wait. We packed what we could, leaving behind anything that wouldn't fit into our bags, and we left. The hike back to the car was long, the darkness pressing in on us, every step filled with the fear that whatever had been out there was still following, still watching. When we finally reached the car, we climbed in, slamming the doors shut, the locks clicking into place. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and we drove away, the forest fading into the distance behind us. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. Whatever had happened out there, whatever we'd seen, it was something we couldn't explain, something we couldn't understand. And as we left the forest behind, I knew one thing for certain. I was never coming back. Story 12. I've spent my entire life tending to sheep in these hills, but nothing could have prepared me for the night that changed everything. The night I realized that sometimes the predator you fear isn't the one you expect. My name is Tom Callahan, and I've been a shepherd on my family's ranch for over 3 decades. We're nestled in a remote valley, surrounded by dense forests and craggy peaks. It's a hard life, but a good one. Or at least, it was, until that fateful evening when the boundaries between the world I knew and the one I never imagined collided. It started with missing sheep. Not an uncommon occurrence in these parts. We've always had to contend with the occasional wolf or mountain lion. But this was different. The animals weren't just killed. They vanished without a trace. No blood, no struggle, just gone. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they'd wandered off, fallen into a ravine, or been taken by a particularly clever predator. But as the weeks went by and more sheep disappeared, a creeping unease settled over the ranch. The breaking point came when I found old Betsy, our eldest ewe, and the backbone of our flock, dead at the edge of the pasture. But it wasn't the fact that she was dead that chilled me to the bone. It was the way she died. Her body was twisted and mangled in a way that no natural predator could have managed. Deep gouges ran along her flanks, but they weren't the clean cuts of claws or teeth. They were ragged, almost deliberate in their cruelty. As I crouched beside Betsy's broken form, my eyes fell on something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth beside her body, was a footprint, but not the print of any animal I'd ever encountered in these hills. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot. The shape was all wrong, too elongated to be a bear, with clear impressions of wickedly curved claws at the tips of what looked disturbingly like toes. And beside it, caught on a tuft of grass, was a clump of coarse, dark hair, unlike anything I'd seen before. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew. Something was out there, something that didn't belong in these woods. That night, I sat on my porch with my old hunting rifle across my lap, watching the tree line as darkness fell. The usual night sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if the entire valley was holding its breath. As the hours ticked by, my eyelids grew heavy. I was just about to head inside when I saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the pasture. I raised my rifle, peering through the scope, but in the dim moonlight I couldn't make out more than a vague, hulking shape. It moved with an unnatural grace for its size, loping across the field towards the sheep pen. As it drew closer, I could see that it walked upright, like a man, but no man I'd ever seen was that big, or moved with such predatory intent. My finger tightened on the trigger, but something held me back. A primal fear that whispered that if I took this shot and missed, I'd be signing my own death warrant. So I watched, my heart pounding in my chest, as the creature reached the pen. With terrifying ease, it ripped the heavy gate from its hinges. The sheep inside began to panic, their frightened bleats cutting through the night air. That's when I saw its face. In the silver moonlight, I caught a glimpse of a muzzle filled with gleaming teeth, eyes that glowed with an eerie yellow light, and ears that came to pointed tips atop its massive, fur-covered head. It was like something out of a nightmare, a twisted amalgamation of wolf and man that defied all logic and reason. As if sensing my gaze, the creature turned, its glowing eyes locking onto me. A low, rumbling growl echoed across the pasture, setting my teeth on edge. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was no longer at the top of the food chain. My survival instincts finally kicked in. I fired off a warning shot, the crack of the rifle shattering the night's silence. The creature flinched, then let out a bone-chilling roar that seemed to shake the very air around me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran for the house, slamming and locking the door behind me. Through the window, I watched as the beast loped back into the forest, dragging one of my sheep effortlessly in its massive, clawed hand. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night with my back to the wall, rifle in hand, jumping at every creak and groan of the old farmhouse. When dawn finally broke, I ventured out to survey the damage. The sheep pen was a wreck, the gate twisted beyond repair, but it was the tracks that truly drove home the reality of what I'd witnessed. There, in the soft earth, was a clear trail of those massive, inhuman footprints leading back into the woods. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit back and watch as this thing decimated my flock, but who could I turn to? The local sheriff would think I was crazy if I started talking about werewolves or Bigfoot, and even if he believed me, what could regular law enforcement do against something like this? In the end, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I spent the day reinforcing the sheep pen, stringing up floodlights around the pasture, and setting up trail cameras at key points along the forest edge. That night, I settled in for a vigil, determined to protect my flock and get proof of what was stalking these hills. For hours, nothing happened. The sheep dozed peacefully in their fortified pen, and the woods remained still and quiet. I was just starting to think that maybe, just maybe, the creature had moved on to easier prey, when one of the floodlights flickered and died. I raised my rifle, heart pounding as I scanned the tree line. There, a flash of movement, a glint of yellow eyes reflecting in the remaining light. The beast had returned. This time, I was ready. As it emerged from the shadows, I squeezed off a shot. The creature roared in pain and fury, but it didn't go down. Instead, it charged straight for me, covering the distance with inhuman speed. I fired again and again, each shot finding its mark. But it was like shooting at a freight train. The bullets slowed it down, but couldn't stop its relentless advance. In seconds, it was upon me. I rolled to the side just as a massive, clawed hand swiped at where I had been standing. The force of the blow splintered the porch railing like kindling. I scrambled backwards, trying to put some distance between us, but I knew it was futile. This thing was too fast, too strong. As it loomed over me, blood matting its dark fur, I closed my eyes and waited for the killing blow. But it never came. Instead, I heard a pained whimper, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. A trail of blood led back into the forest, quickly swallowed up by the shadows. I sat there for a long time, my whole body shaking, trying to process what had just happened. In the days that followed, I scoured the woods for any sign of the beast, but found nothing. No tracks, no fur, not even a drop of blood. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. The trail cameras yielded no clear images, just blurry shapes that could have been anything. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? Instead, I've kept a quiet vigil, always watching the tree line, always ready. I've tripled my security measures and started bringing the sheep in at night. So far, it seems to be working. There have been no more attacks, no more mysterious disappearances, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I hear a distant howl echoing through the valley, and I know that out there, somewhere in the dark woods, something is waiting, something that doesn't belong in this world, but exists all the same. So I keep watch, night after night, my rifle close at hand, because I've seen what lurks in the shadows, and I know that the line between predator and prey is thinner than we'd like to believe. And in these remote hills, sometimes the shepherd must become the guardian against terrors beyond imagination. Story 13. The scream echoed off the cliffs, carrying through the stillness of the canyon, a sound so full of agony that it made my blood run cold. I froze, my fingers tightening around the straps of my backpack, the desolate landscape suddenly feeling much more dangerous. That was no animal. It was a human voice, twisted in pain, coming from somewhere up ahead. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I knew I had to find out what it was. The hike had started off as a way to clear my head. I had been looking for solitude, a day away from the constant noise of the world, and the canyon had seemed like the perfect place. Miles of empty desert, rock formations carved by time, and a trail that few people dared to take. I parked my car at the edge of the dirt road, the morning sun just beginning to rise, and set off into the wilderness, the weight of my pack on my shoulders and the comforting crunch of gravel underfoot. By midday, the sun was high, a blazing orb in a cloudless sky, and I had already covered several miles. The path wound through the canyon, the rock walls towering on either side, a narrow strip of blue sky above. I hadn't seen another person all day, and that was exactly how I wanted it. There was a kind of peace out here that I couldn't find anywhere else, a silence that let me think without distraction. But that scream shattered the peace, turning the quiet into something menacing. My heart pounded in my chest, my eyes scanning the cliffs, the empty stretches of desert beyond. The sound had been close, but the canyon made everything echo, bouncing the noise from wall to wall, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. It had sounded desperate, like someone in real trouble, someone who needed help. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave whatever it was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling, the compulsion to know. What if someone was hurt out here, far from help? I couldn't just walk away, not without at least trying. I took a deep breath, adjusting the straps of my backpack, and started forward, my footsteps careful on the loose gravel. The canyon narrowed as I moved further in, the rock walls closing in on either side, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower. My ears strained for any sound, any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the whisper of wind through the narrow pass, the soft crunch of my footsteps, and then, faintly, I heard it again, a cry, a weak, drawn-out wail that seemed to echo from every direction. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a chill running down my spine. It was a voice unmistakably human, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound right, as if it was both close and far at the same time, distorted by the canyon's strange acoustics. I pushed forward, my pulse quickening, my flashlight ready in my hand, even though there was still daylight left. The path wound sharply to the right, and I paused for a moment before turning the corner, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The cry had gone quiet again, and the silence was thick, almost suffocating, the canyon pressing in on all sides. As I rounded the bend, I saw something up ahead, a dark shape lying on the ground, half hidden by a cluster of rocks. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickened my pace, my boots crunching against the gravel as I approached. It was a person, a man, his clothes torn and dirty, his body sprawled awkwardly as if he'd fallen from a great height. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Are you okay?" He didn't move, didn't respond. My stomach twisted as I got closer, the details coming into focus. His skin was pale, almost grey, his eyes closed, his mouth slightly open. For a moment, I thought he was dead, my heart sinking. But then I saw his chest move, a shallow, ragged breath, and I dropped to my knees beside him, my fingers brushing against his shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" I asked, my voice softer now, trying to keep the panic out of my tone. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment they locked onto mine. There was something in them, something wild, something terrified. His lips moved, forming a single word, so faint I almost didn't hear it. "Run!" A chill ran through me, and I pulled back, my heart pounding. "What?" I asked, but his eyes had already closed again, his body going limp. I looked around, my pulse racing, the canyon suddenly feeling much narrower, the walls closing in. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, oppressive, the shadows deepening far too quickly for the time of day. And then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold, a rustling, a shifting of rocks coming from somewhere above me. Slowly, I lifted my head, my eyes scanning the cliffside, the dark crevices that seemed to go on forever. There, high above, something moved, a shadow shifting against the rock, something tall and impossibly thin. I stared, my breath caught in my throat, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. It moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs long and gaunt, its body barely more than a silhouette against the rock. And then it turned its head, and I saw its eyes, two pinpricks of light, reflecting the fading sun, staring down at me. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the loose gravel, my heart pounding in my ears. The man had told me to run, and every instinct screamed at me to do just that, to turn and get as far away from this place as possible. I pushed myself to my feet, my eyes still locked on the thing above me, and then I turned, breaking into a run, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. The canyon seemed to twist and shift around me, the path that had felt so clear just hours before now, a labyrinth of rock and shadow. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the walls of the canyon seeming to close in, the shadows growing deeper, darker. The rustling sound followed me, echoing off the cliffs, a reminder that whatever was up there, it was moving too, keeping pace, stalking me from above. I rounded a bend, my legs burning, and for a moment I lost my footing, my ankle twisting painfully as I stumbled. I caught myself against the rock wall, my palms scraping against the rough surface, and I dared a glance upward. The thing was still there, moving along the cliffside, its limbs bending in ways that made my stomach twist with fear. It was following me, relentless, its eyes never leaving me. I pushed off the wall, forcing myself to keep moving, each step sending a jolt of pain through my ankle. I had to get out of the canyon, had to get to the open desert where I could see it, where I had a chance of escape. The rustling grew louder, closer, and I could feel it now, the presence, the weight of something watching me, hunting me. The path opened up suddenly, the canyon walls giving way to a wide expanse of desert, the sky above tinged with the orange of the setting sun. I ran, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air, the open space both a relief and a terror. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to go but forward. I glanced back, my eyes scanning the cliffs, and for a moment I saw it, standing at the edge of the canyon, its form silhouetted against the sky, tall and skeletal, its head cocked to one side as it watched me. I kept running, my eyes fixed on the distant line of my car, the only thing that seemed real in the nightmare that had become this day. The desert stretched out before me, endless and empty, but I knew I couldn't stop, couldn't rest, not until I was far away from whatever that thing was. The sun dipped lower, the shadows lengthening, the world around me fading into twilight. When I finally reached the car, I threw myself against the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still feel it, the eyes, the presence, the sense of something out there, just beyond the edge of the light. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the growing darkness, and I sped away, the tires kicking up dust as I left the canyon behind. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove, the road a blur beneath me, the desert fading into night, my mind racing with the image of that thing, its eyes reflecting the last light of day. I didn't know what it was, didn't know if it was real or some figment of my fear, but I knew one thing. I was never coming back. The canyon could keep its secrets, its screams, its shadows. Some places were meant to be left alone. Story 14. I've always believed that science could explain everything, but after what I witnessed in those woods, I'm not so sure anymore. Some things, it seems, defy all rational explanation. My name is Amanda Chen, and I'm a graduate student in wildlife biology, or at least I was, until the night that changed everything. It was supposed to be a straightforward research project, set up some trail cameras, gather data on local wildlife populations, and write my thesis. Simple, right? If only I'd known what I was really about to uncover. It all started on a crisp autumn morning. I'd been granted permission to conduct my research in a remote area of the Cascade Mountains, an old-growth forest that had remained largely untouched by human activity. The perfect place to study natural animal behaviors, or so I thought. I spent the first few days scouting locations and setting up my equipment. 20 high-definition trail cameras with night vision capabilities, strategically placed to capture the movements of deer, elk, and the occasional bear or mountain lion. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I dismissed it as nerves. After all, I was alone in the wilderness. It was natural to feel a little on edge. A week passed, and I returned to check the cameras and collect the first batch of data. Most of the footage was exactly what I'd expected. Deer grazing, a family of raccoons foraging, even a majestic bull elk bugling in the early morning mist. But as I reviewed the files from the camera deepest in the woods, my blood ran cold. There, in the grainy night vision footage, was a figure I couldn't explain. It moved on 2 legs, like a human, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad, with arms that seemed to hang down to its knees, and it was covered in what looked like thick, matted fur. I replayed the clip dozens of times, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs. No, the gait was all wrong. A person in a costume, out here, miles from the nearest road. It didn't make sense. I decided to keep this discovery to myself for the time being. After all, I had no concrete evidence of what the creature was. Just a blurry, 5-second video clip that could be explained away as a trick of light and shadow. I needed more data. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the research with renewed vigor. I added more cameras, focusing on the area where the strange figure had been spotted. Most nights, I camped nearby, telling myself it was to protect my equipment from potential vandals. But deep down, I knew I was hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature myself. It was on one of these nights that it happened. I was huddled in my tent, reviewing the day's footage on my laptop, when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite bear, not quite wolf, but somehow more primal and terrifying than both combined. My heart pounding, I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the darkness. The forest was eerily still, as if every living thing was holding its breath. And then I saw them, 2 glowing eyes, reflecting the light from my lantern. They were at least 7 feet off the ground, set in a shadowy form that seemed to absorb the darkness around it. I'd like to say I acted bravely, that I grabbed my camera and tried to document what I was seeing, but the truth is, I was paralyzed with fear. I watched, scarcely breathing, as the creature moved with impossible silence through the underbrush. It paused at one of my trail cameras, studying it with what seemed like curiosity. Then, with a swiftness that belied its size, it melted back into the shadows. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that I dared to emerge from my tent. I half expected to find my campsite destroyed, my equipment in shambles, but everything was exactly as I'd left it. The only evidence of the night's encounter was a single, massive footprint at the edge of the clearing. It was easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear impressions of wickedly curved claws. I photographed and measured the print, my scientific training kicking in despite my lingering fear. But as I stood there, staring at the undeniable evidence of something that shouldn't exist, I was hit with a chilling realization. I was no longer the observer in this scenario. I had become the subject of study. The next few days were a blur of feverish activity. I pored over every second of footage from my cameras, searching for any glimpse of the creature, and I found them. Fleeting shadows, brief movements just at the edge of the frame. Never a clear image, but enough to confirm that what I'd seen wasn't a hallucination. I debated whether to share my findings with my academic advisor, but every time I drafted an email or started to make a call, I stopped myself. Who would believe me? Without clear evidence, I'd be laughed out of the scientific community. My career would be over before it began, so I kept it to myself, growing more obsessed with each passing day. I neglected my original research, focusing all my energy on tracking the creature. I set up more cameras, spent hours sitting in blinds, hoping for another encounter, and then, one evening as I was changing out the memory cards in my cameras, I felt it again, that prickling sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and there it was, standing at the edge of a clearing, partially obscured by the gathering dusk, was the creature. It was even more imposing than I'd imagined. At least 8 feet tall, with a broad, powerful frame covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and wolf, with intelligent eyes that locked onto mine with unsettling intensity. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. I was acutely aware of the camera in my hands, of the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity this represented. But I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature took a step forward, its massive foot leaving an impression in the soft earth. That broke my paralysis. I raised the camera with shaking hands and managed to snap a single photo before my fight-or-flight response kicked in. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. I don't know how long I ran or how I found my way back to my campsite. The rest of that night is a blur of terror and adrenaline. When I finally calmed down enough to check the camera, my heart sank. The photo was dark and blurry, showing little more than a vague, shadowy form, useless as evidence. In the days that followed, I grappled with what to do next. The rational, scientific part of my brain insisted that I needed more data, more evidence. But every instinct screamed at me to get as far away from these woods as possible. In the end, fear won out. I packed up my equipment and left, my research unfinished. I told my advisor I'd fallen ill and needed to take a leave of absence. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was sick with fear and doubt, my worldview shaken to its core. I've spent the months since then trying to make sense of what I experienced. I've pored over cryptozoology forums, read every account of Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings I could find. Some dismiss me as a crackpot when I share my story. Others believe me all too readily, eager to accept any evidence of the unexplained. The truth is, I don't know what to believe anymore. I went into those woods as a scientist, certain that the natural world could be quantified and categorized. I came out with the unsettling knowledge that there are things out there that defy explanation, creatures that blur the line between legend and reality. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking at that blurry photo, the only tangible evidence of my encounter, and I wonder, what if I had stayed? What if I had pursued my research? Consequences be damned. What might I have discovered? But then I remember those glowing eyes in the darkness, that sense of being studied by something far more ancient and powerful than myself. And I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because once you glimpse the truth behind the veil of the known world, there's no going back. You can only move forward, carrying the weight of that knowledge and wondering what other secrets the shadows might hold. Story 15. The sheep were gone again. I could see the trail of blood, dark and glistening under the moonlight, leading from the pasture and disappearing into the woods beyond the fence. My stomach twisted with a mix of dread and frustration as I scanned the empty field, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Something was taking them, something big, and tonight I was going to find out what. I had grown up on this farm, surrounded by acres of fields, pastures, and woods that stretched out as far as the eye could see. It was a quiet, secluded life, just me, my father, and the sheep. We had always been able to fend for ourselves, dealing with the usual challenges that came with farm life, coyotes, bad weather, broken fences. But lately, something had been happening that we couldn't explain. The sheep had started disappearing. At first, we thought it was just a few wandering off. The fence was old, the pasture wide, and sometimes the sheep would slip away, lost in the woods. But when we found the first few carcasses, it became clear this was something else. The bodies were torn apart, as if something had ripped into them with claws and teeth. My father said it was a bear, but the tracks we found weren't like any bear I'd ever seen. They were bigger, almost canine, and they left a deep imprint in the soft earth. The local authorities weren't much help. They told us it was probably a wolf, maybe even a big dog. They shrugged it off, told us to reinforce the fence, maybe bring the sheep in at night, but I knew there was more to it. I had heard the noises at night, the low, rumbling growls, the sound of something moving through the trees. It wasn't a wolf. It was something else, something that didn't belong here. Tonight I'd had enough. I couldn't just sit inside the house and listen to the sheep crying out, only to find another empty pasture in the morning. I grabbed the flashlight, pulled on my boots, and headed out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the fields, the wind rustling through the grass. I could see my breath, my heart pounding as I approached the fence, the beam of my flashlight bobbing in front of me. The pasture was empty, the sheep huddled together in the far corner, their eyes wide and frightened. I followed the trail of blood, my stomach churning as I saw the dark, wet path leading towards the woods. My father had always warned me about going into the woods at night. Too easy to get lost, too easy to stumble into something you couldn't see. But tonight, I couldn't let that stop me. Whatever was out there, it had to be stopped. I climbed over the fence, my boots sinking into the soft earth as I landed on the other side. The woods loomed ahead, dark and silent, the trees standing like sentinels, their branches casting skeletal shadows across the ground. I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around the flashlight, and stepped into the trees, the world around me swallowed by darkness. The air was different in the woods, thicker, colder, the wind barely making it through the dense branches above. I moved carefully, each step deliberate, the beam of my flashlight sweeping back and forth, catching glimpses of leaves, branches, the occasional flash of red from a low bush. The trail of blood was harder to follow now, broken by the uneven ground, but I could still see it, leading deeper into the forest. I hadn't gone far when I heard it, a rustling, somewhere up ahead, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my eyes straining to see past the beam of my flashlight. The rustling stopped, replaced by a low growl, deep and guttural, that seemed to reverberate through the trees. My heart pounded, and I took a step back, the beam of the flashlight trembling as I swung it towards the sound. The light caught on something, a flash of movement, a shadow shifting between the trees. It was big, taller than any person, its shape wrong, hunched, almost like a wolf but upright, its eyes catching the light and glowing faintly in the darkness. I gasped, stumbling back, my foot catching on a root. I went down hard, the flashlight slipping from my hand, the beam spinning wildly before it went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me, my hands scrambling against the ground, trying to find the flashlight. I could hear it now, the heavy footfalls, the sound of something moving towards me, slow, deliberate. My fingers closed around the flashlight, and I clicked it back on, the beam cutting through the darkness just in time to see the creature step out from between the trees. It was massive, its fur dark and matted, its face elongated, almost canine, but with a twisted, almost human quality. Its eyes locked onto mine, and it bared its teeth, a low, rumbling growl escaping from deep within its chest. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't think. I just ran, the woods a blur around me, the branches whipping at my face, my feet pounding against the uneven ground. I could hear it behind me, the sound of it crashing through the underbrush, its growl growing louder, more insistent. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The trees seemed to close in around me, the path twisting and turning, my mind racing as I tried to remember which way I had come. I could feel it gaining on me, the sound of its footfalls growing closer, the growl now a roar that shook me to my core. I pushed myself harder, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the field, of the open space where I might have a chance. And then, suddenly, the trees parted, and I burst out into the clearing, the moonlight bright against the open field. I didn't stop, my legs carrying me forward towards the fence, the safety of the farm just beyond. I could hear it behind me, the creature crashing out of the woods, its growl echoing across the open space. I reached the fence, my hands gripping the wood, and I threw myself over, landing hard on the other side, my body rolling as I hit the ground. I scrambled to my feet, turning just in time to see the creature at the edge of the woods, its eyes locked onto mine, its body tense, as if ready to leap. But it didn't cross the fence, it just stood there, its growl rumbling through the night, its eyes glowing with a hatred that made my blood run cold. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the creature on one side of the fence, me on the other, the air between us thick with tension, and then, slowly, it turned, disappearing back into the woods, the darkness swallowing it whole. I stood there, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my eyes fixed on the spot where it had vanished. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen, of what had just happened. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a bear. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. Slowly, I turned, my eyes scanning the pasture, the sheep still huddled in the far corner, their eyes wide, their bodies tense. I walked towards the house, my legs unsteady, my hands still shaking as I opened the door and stepped inside. My father was waiting, his eyes wide with worry, his face pale. "Did you see it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my throat tight, my mind still struggling to find the words. It's not an animal," I said, my voice trembling. "It's something else." He didn't say anything, just nodded, his eyes filled with a fear that I had never seen before. We both knew what it meant. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to stop. And as I looked out the window, the dark line of the woods just visible in the distance, I knew one thing for certain. The farm would never be the same again. Story 16. The scream ripped through the night, the kind of sound that makes every hair on your body stand on end. My friends and I were sitting around the campfire, the flames crackling softly when it cut through the air like a knife. We all froze, our laughter dying in our throats as we turned to look towards the dark wall of trees surrounding our camp. It wasn't just any scream, it sounded like one of us, like someone calling for help in a voice I knew all too well. There were 4 of us, me, Mike, Jen and Carla, out for a weekend of camping in the deep woods. We had picked a spot far away from any marked trails, a clearing that Mike had heard about from someone at work, promising isolation and a real taste of the wilderness. It had seemed like a great idea at the time. Get away from the noise of the city, have some beers by the fire, tell ghost stories, and just enjoy being out under the stars without another soul for miles. The first day had gone by perfectly. We hiked, set up camp, gathered firewood and laughed until our stomachs hurt as the sun began to dip below the horizon. By the time night fell, we had a good fire going and the sky was full of stars. We were relaxed, happy, everything going just as planned, and then the scream happened. It was sudden, out of nowhere, a chilling cry that echoed through the woods. For a split second, I thought maybe it was some kind of animal, a fox or a coyote, but then I realized it wasn't. It was a human voice, twisted in fear, and it sounded like Carla. Mike and I exchanged a look, his eyes wide, his face pale in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding, my eyes fixed on the dark line of trees. Jen was sitting across from me, her face frozen in shock, and Carla was right beside her, her eyes wide and frightened. "It sounded like," Jen began, her voice trailing off as she looked at Carla, who shook her head slowly, her lips pressed together in a tight line. "It sounded like me," Carla whispered, her voice shaking. We all sat there, staring at each other, the fire crackling between us, the darkness pressing in from all sides. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we had just heard. It had been Carla's voice, no doubt about it, the same pitch, the same tone, calling out for help from somewhere in the woods. But Carla was right here, sitting next to Jen, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Maybe it was an echo or something, Mike suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "An echo of what?" Jen snapped, her fear making her voice sharp. "Carla didn't scream." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and looked back towards the trees. The firelight only reached so far, the glow fading into darkness. And beyond that, there was nothing but shadows. "We should check it out," I said, my voice trembling even as I spoke the words. "Are you crazy?" Carla hissed, her eyes wide. "We don't even know what that was." "That's exactly why we need to check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. What if someone's out there and they need help? Mike nodded slowly, though he looked far from convinced. He stood up, grabbing the flashlight from beside his chair, and I did the same, the weight of it reassuring in my hand. Jen and Carla stayed by the fire, their eyes following us as we moved towards the edge of the clearing, the darkness seeming to grow thicker with every step. "Be careful," Jen said, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. I nodded, my heart pounding as I stepped into the shadows, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the trees and the underbrush below. Mike was right beside me, his own flashlight flickering slightly as we moved deeper into the woods. The air was colder here, the warmth of the fire quickly fading as we moved further away from camp. The woods were silent, the kind of silence that felt wrong, like everything was holding its breath. My ears strained for any sound, any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the soft crunch of our footsteps on the forest floor, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. "Carla?" Mike called out, his voice echoing through the trees, the sound quickly swallowed by the darkness. There was no answer. I swung my flashlight around, the beam catching on the rough bark of the trees, the twisted shapes of branches. Everything looked the same, the shadows shifting and moving as the light passed over them, and I felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that we were being watched. "Maybe we should head back," Mike said, his voice tense. "I don't like this." I was about to agree when we heard it again. The scream. It was closer this time, louder, the same desperate cry for help. And it was definitely Carla's voice. My blood ran cold, and I turned towards the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "That was her," I whispered, my throat tight. "That was Carla." "But she's back at camp," Mike said, his voice barely audible, his eyes wide with fear. I took a step forward, my heart pounding, my eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "We have to see what it is," I said, though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to run back to the safety of the fire. We moved towards the sound, the darkness growing thicker, the trees closing in around us. The beam of my flashlight wavered, the light flickering slightly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite name, a sense of wrongness that seemed to seep into my bones. And then, just ahead, I saw something. A figure, standing between the trees, barely visible in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I lifted the flashlight, the beam illuminating the figure's face. It was Carla. I stared, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. She was standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide, her mouth open as if she was about to scream. But something was wrong. Her expression was blank, her eyes empty, like she was staring right through me. "Carla," I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't move, didn't respond. She just stood there, her body stiff, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. A shiver ran through me, and I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Mike, do you see this?" I asked, my voice barely audible. But when I turned to look at Mike, he was gone. The beam of his flashlight was nowhere to be seen, the darkness swallowing everything around me. Panic surged through me, my heart pounding, and I turned back to where Carla had been standing, but she was gone too, the space between the trees empty once more. I was alone. A cold knot of fear tightened in my chest, and I turned, my flashlight flickering as I started back towards the camp, my footsteps quick, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The woods felt different now, the darkness deeper, the shadows shifting and moving as if they were alive. My ears strained for any sound, any sign of Mike, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence, the sense of being watched. I stumbled into the clearing, the fire still crackling, the light casting long shadows across the ground. Jen and Carla were still there, sitting by the fire, their faces turning towards me as I approached. Carla looked at me, her eyes wide, her face pale, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "What happened?" Jen asked, her voice trembling. "Where's Mike?" I shook my head, my throat tight, my mind racing. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He was right behind me, and then he was just gone." Carla looked at me, her eyes filled with fear. "I heard it again," she said, her voice shaking. "The scream! It sounded like me." I stared at her, my heart pounding. The memory of the figure in the woods burned into my mind. It had looked like Carla. It had been Carla, but it hadn't been her. It was something else, something that had taken her form, something that was trying to draw us in. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." Jen nodded, her eyes wide, and Carla stood, her hands shaking as she grabbed her bag. We didn't bother packing up the camp. We just grabbed what we could and started back towards the trail, the darkness pressing in around us, the firelight fading behind us. The woods were silent as we moved, the only sound the crunch of our footsteps on the forest floor, the occasional snap of a twig. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak, and I felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that we were being followed, that something was out there just beyond the edge of the light watching. When we finally reached the car, I felt a surge of relief, my body trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The door finally unlocking. We climbed inside, slamming the door shut, the locks clicking into place, and I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As we drove away, the woods fading into the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that whatever had been out there was still watching, still waiting. The memory of the scream, of the figure in the woods, lingered in my mind, a reminder of something I couldn't understand, something that shouldn't exist. Somewhere, deep in those woods, something had taken Carla's voice, her face, and used it against us. And as we left the forest behind, I knew one thing for certain: we had been lucky to get away. Story 17. I never believed in monsters until I became one myself. Not the kind with fangs and claws, but the type that hides in the shadows, paralyzed by fear, while someone else fights for their life. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I learned that the true beasts lurking in the forest aren't always the ones you can see. It was my third week as a junior park ranger at Blackwater National Forest. The job was a dream come true. I'd always loved nature and wanted to protect it. Plus, after 4 years of college, I was eager to trade textbooks for trees. The senior rangers were welcoming, if a bit patronizing. I could see it in their eyes. Another city girl who thinks she can hack it in the wild. I was determined to prove them wrong. That night, I volunteered for the late patrol. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where your breath hangs in the air like a ghost. The forest was alive with the rustling of nocturnal creatures and the gentle sway of branches in the breeze. I felt alive, connected to something ancient and primal. About an hour into my rounds, I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was a low, guttural noise, somewhere between a growl and a moan. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight on my belt. The beam cut through the darkness, dancing across tree trunks and undergrowth. Nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "It's probably just a bear," I muttered, more to hear my own voice than out of any real conviction. Bears were common in these parts, but something about that sound felt different. I continued down the trail, my senses on high alert. The forest seemed to have gone unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. That's when I saw them. The tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print. But it wasn't just the size that unnerved me. The shape was all wrong. They looked almost human, but elongated, with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. I knelt down, my fingers hovering just above the impression in the soft earth. Whatever made these was heavy. The tracks were deep. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting a frantic arc through the darkness. Nothing but trees and shadows, but I could feel it, eyes watching me from the gloom. "Hello!" I called out. hating how small and scared my voice sounded. "This is Park Ranger Sarah Coleman. Is anyone there?" Silence. I reached for my radio, my fingers fumbling with the dial. "Base, this is Sarah. I found some unusual tracks out on the East Trail. Requesting backup to investigate." Static crackled, then a familiar voice. "Copy that, Sarah. What's your exact location?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat. There, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach, I saw movement. A massive dark shape, easily 7 feet tall, melted from one shadow to another. I'm not sure," I whispered into the radio, my eyes never leaving the spot where I'd seen the figure. "Something's out here with me." "Sarah, you're breaking up. Can you repeat your location?" The shape moved again, closer this time. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of eyes reflecting the light like twin moons. "Oh, God," I breathed, stumbling backward. My heel caught on a root, and I went down hard, the radio flying from my hand. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning the flashlight in my panic, and then I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, heavy footfalls and the sound of vegetation being crushed underfoot. It was fast, much faster than anything that big should be. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. A root caught my foot, and I went down again, this time tumbling down a short embankment. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me. As I lay there, gasping for air, I realized I'd found my way to Raven's Creek, a small stream that cut through this part of the forest. The sound of rushing water filled my ears, but underneath it, I could hear something else. Heavy breathing, not my own. I rolled onto my side, peering into the darkness. There it was, a hulking silhouette at the top of the embankment. Even in the dim moonlight, I could make out its massive frame, the way it stood on 2 legs like a man, but with the bulk and fur of a bear. Its head swiveled, scanning the area, and I knew it was looking for me. I held my breath, pressing myself into the damp earth, praying to every god I could think of that it wouldn't spot me. For a moment that stretched into eternity, it stood there, a primal force of nature given form. Then, with a low growl that I felt in my bones, it turned and lumbered back into the forest. I don't know how long I lay there, shaking and sobbing silently. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I found the strength to stand on wobbly legs. I was lost, weaponless, and had no way to call for help. But I was alive, and that meant I had a chance. Using the creek as a guide, I started walking. I knew it would eventually lead me to the ranger station if I followed it long enough. Every shadow made me flinch. Every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. But nothing attacked, nothing pursued. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, I stumbled out of the tree line and into the parking lot of the ranger station. I must have looked a sight, uniform torn and muddy, hair wild, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. "Sarah," a voice called out. It was Mike, one of the senior rangers, just arriving for the morning shift. "My God, what happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I got lost, I finally managed, my voice hoarse. Fell down an embankment. Radio broke. Mike's face softened with sympathy and just a touch of "I told you so." "Let's get you inside, kid. You look like you've been through hell." As he led me towards the station, I glanced back at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a flash of movement at the tree line, a pair of eyes reflecting the early morning light. But when I blinked, it was gone. In the days that followed, I told myself it had all been a product of fear and exhaustion. The tracks, probably just a large bear. The shape I'd seen, a trick of shadows and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I had come face to face with one of them and lived to tell the tale. But the encounter changed me. I stayed on as a ranger, determined not to let one night of terror drive me away from the job I loved. But I never patrolled alone again, and I always kept one eye on the shadows, watching for movement. Because now I know, sometimes the monsters are real, and they're watching us just as closely as we're watching for them. Story 18. I used to think that the worst sound in the world was silence. That eerie stillness when even the crickets stop chirping and you can hear your own heartbeat pounding in your ears. But I was wrong. The worst sound is something inhuman breathing just outside your tent, inches away from where you lie, frozen in terror. My name is Mike, and what happened to my wife Jenny and me in the backcountry of Olympic National Park still haunts my dreams. We were seasoned campers, the type who scoffed at RVs and glamping. We lived for those moments of solitude in nature, far from the noise and chaos of civilization. But that night, we discovered that true solitude comes with a price. It was supposed to be a romantic getaway to celebrate our 5th anniversary. Jenny had always wanted to explore the more remote areas of the park, and I was eager to prove my outdoorsman skills. We'd heard the stories, of course, tales of strange creatures and unexplained phenomena in the dense forests, but we laughed them off as campfire ghost stories meant to scare tourists. The first 2 days of our trip were idyllic. We hiked through pristine wilderness, marveling at towering redwoods and crystal-clear streams. On the 3rd day, we ventured off the main trail, following an old logging road that wasn't on any of our maps. Jenny was thrilled at the sense of adventure, and I'll admit, I felt a surge of pride at leading us into uncharted territory. As dusk approached, we found a small clearing near a babbling brook, the perfect spot to make camp. I set up our tent while Jenny gathered firewood. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It felt like we were the only 2 people in the world. After a dinner of dehydrated stroganoff, which tastes a lot better when you're miles from the nearest restaurant, we sat by the fire, sharing a flask of whiskey and watching the stars emerge overhead. Jenny leaned against me, her head on my shoulder. "This is perfect," she murmured. "Just us and the wilderness." I kissed the top of her head. "Happy anniversary, babe." We doused the fire and crawled into our tent, snuggling close in our double sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest, the gentle rush of the stream, the occasional hoot of an owl, lulled us to sleep. I'm not sure what woke me. Maybe it was the sudden absence of those nighttime noises, or perhaps some primal instinct sensed a change in our surroundings. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there, heart racing, straining to hear anything beyond the canvas walls of our tent. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. This sound was deeper, more guttural, almost human, but not quite. Jenny stirred beside me. "Mike," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Dee, what was that?" "Shh," I breathed, my arm tightening around her. "It's probably just a bear. Stay still." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Bears don't move the way this thing moved, with slow, deliberate steps that seemed to circle our campsite. Each footfall was heavy, like something massive was stalking us. Jenny's fingers dug into my arm as another growl vibrated through the air. It was closer now, and I could hear something else mixed in with it, a wet, snuffling sound, like whatever it was out there was scenting the air. "We need to do something," Jenny whispered urgently. "We can't just lie here." She was right, of course, but the thought of leaving the flimsy protection of our tent, of confronting whatever was out there in the darkness, filled me with a paralyzing dread. Another step, this one right next to our tent. I could see the shadow of something enormous silhouetted against the moonlit canvas. My breath caught in my throat as I watched a clawed hand, far too large to be human, press against the side of the tent. Jenny whimpered, burying her face in my chest. I knew I had to act. I was her husband, damn it. I was supposed to protect her. With shaking hands, I reached for the flashlight and hunting knife I kept next to our sleeping bag. The metal of the blade felt cold and inadequate in my grip. "I'm going to look outside," I whispered to Jenny. "If I tell you to run, you run. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. Just run for the car. Understand?" She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Slowly, trying to control my ragged breathing, I unzipped the tent flap. The sound seemed deafening in the unnatural silence of the forest. Inch by inch, I pushed the flap aside and poked my head out. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, a movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the trees, was a shape that didn't belong. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, and covered in thick, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear. It stood on 2 legs, its posture unnervingly human-like. As I watched, frozen in horror, it turned its head towards me. 2 eyes reflected the beam of my flashlight, glowing an eerie yellow-green. They were intelligent eyes, filled with a predatory cunning that made my blood run cold. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other, man and monster, prey and predator. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the creature lunged towards our tent. "Run!" I screamed, scrambling out of the tent and pulling Jenny with me. We sprinted towards the trees, the sound of heavy footfalls and splintering wood behind us, telling me that the thing had torn through our tent like it was tissue paper. Jenny stumbled, and I hauled her to her feet, pushing her ahead of me. "Keep going," I yelled, risking a glance over my shoulder. The creature was gaining on us, moving with a loping gait that ate up the distance between us. In the moonlight, I caught glimpses of its features, an elongated snout filled with gleaming teeth, powerful arms ending in wicked claws, and those eyes, burning with hunger and something that looked unsettlingly like intelligence. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces and arms. I had no idea where we were going. All I knew was that we had to put distance between us and that thing. Suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. Jenny and I tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling through leaves and dirt until we splashed into icy water. We had found the stream that ran near our campsite, swollen with recent rains. "The current!" I gasped, grabbing Jenny's arm. "It might mask our scent!" We waded into the rushing water, fighting to keep our footing on the slippery rocks. The cold shocked the breath from my lungs, but fear kept us moving. Above us, on the ridge we had just tumbled down, a dark shape appeared. It paced back and forth, those glowing eyes scanning the water. Had we lost it? Then, with a roar that shook leaves from the trees, it began to make its way down the slope towards us. "There!" Jenny pointed urgently. A fallen tree stretched across the stream, creating a natural bridge. "We can cross and climb up the other side." It was our only chance. We half swam, half stumbled towards the log. I boosted Jenny up first, then scrambled after her, my wet clothes weighing me down. We were halfway across when I heard a splash behind us. The creature had entered the water. Go, I urged Jenny, practically shoving her across the log. As she reached the other side, I turned to face our pursuer. It was almost upon us, water streaming from its shaggy fur. In the moonlight, I could see every terrifying detail. The way its muscles rippled beneath its skin, the steam rising from its panting breath in the cold air. I raised my hunting knife, knowing it was a futile gesture. This thing could tear me apart with one swipe of its massive claws, but I had to give Jenny time to escape. Just as the creature reached the log, its weight causing the dead wood to groan and shift, a piercing whistle cut through the night. The beast's head snapped around, looking back the way it had come. Another whistle, this one longer and more insistent. To my utter astonishment, the creature let out a frustrated growl and turned away. With powerful strokes, it swam back to the far bank and disappeared into the forest, melting into the shadows as if it had never existed. I stood there, knife still raised, shaking with adrenaline and cold. Jenny's arms wrapped around me from behind. and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. What was that thing?" I shook my head, unable to form words. We clung to each other, watching the spot where the creature had vanished, half expecting it to reappear at any moment, but it didn't. Whatever had called it away seemed to have a stronger hold than its desire to hunt us. We made our way back to our destroyed campsite as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky. Our tent was in tatters, claw marks raking through the canvas, but our backpacks, tossed aside in the creature's initial attack, were still intact. As we gathered our belongings with shaking hands, I found myself scanning the tree line, unable to shake the feeling that we were still being watched. "Mike," Jenny said softly, holding up a tuft of coarse, dark hair snagged on a branch. "What do we tell people?" I took the hair from her, rubbing it between my fingers. It was like nothing I'd ever felt before, too coarse for a bear, too long for a cougar. "The truth," I said finally. "We tell them the truth, and hope they believe us." We hiked out of the backcountry in record time, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. When we finally reached our car, the relief was overwhelming. As we drove away from Olympic National Park, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The forest loomed behind us, vast and ancient, hiding secrets that defied explanation. I used to think I knew the wilderness. Now I understand that there are things out there beyond our comprehension, creatures that exist in the shadows of our world. And sometimes, if we venture too far off the beaten path, we might just come face to face with them. Jenny squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back. We had survived, but we were changed. The wilderness would never look the same to us again, because now we knew sometimes the monsters in the campfire stories are real. And they're watching, waiting for unwary travelers to stray into their domain. Story 19. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but the one I almost took that day in the Cascade Mountains would have been worth 1,000,000. It would have changed everything we thought we knew about the natural world. Instead, all I have is the memory of those eyes staring back at me, and the knowledge that some secrets are better left hidden in the depths of the forest. My name is Tom Hawkins, and I've been a wildlife photographer for over 2 decades. I've captured images of elusive snow leopards in the Himalayas and swam with great white sharks off the coast of South Africa. But nothing in my career prepared me for what I encountered in the lush forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was late September, and I had been commissioned by National Geographic to document the changing colors of the Cascade Mountains during fall. I'd spent weeks scouting locations, looking for the perfect vantage points to capture the transformation of the landscape. On this particular morning, I had hiked deep into a remote area of the forest, far from any marked trails. The air was crisp and heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. A light mist clung to the forest floor, giving everything an ethereal quality. I had set up my blind, a camouflaged tent-like structure near a small clearing. It was the perfect spot to capture both the vibrant foliage and any wildlife that might wander by. I settled in for a long wait, my camera ready on its tripod. Hours passed, and I managed to get some beautiful shots of a family of deer and a curious black bear foraging for berries. But as the afternoon wore on, a strange stillness settled over the forest. The usual chatter of birds and small animals faded away, leaving an unsettling silence. That's when I first noticed the movement. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But as I peered through my telephoto lens, I saw something that made my heart race. There, partially obscured by a cluster of trees about 100 yards away, was a large, bipedal figure. My first thought was that it must be another hiker, although I knew how unlikely that was given how far I'd ventured from any marked trails. But as I watched, I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't human. Its proportions were all wrong, too tall, too broad, with arms that seemed to hang down to its knees. I held my breath, hardly daring to move as I adjusted my camera. The figure was covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. It moved with an odd, loping gait, pausing occasionally to scan its surroundings. That's when it hit me. I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Something that was only supposed to live in campfire stories and blurry videos on the internet. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, I was staring at a living, breathing cryptid. My hands shook as I tried to focus the camera. This was the shot of a lifetime, the kind of evidence that could rewrite biology textbooks and make me a legend in my field. But every time I thought I had the creature in frame, it would move, obscured by trees or undergrowth. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I watched the creature through my lens. It seemed to be foraging, occasionally reaching up to pull something from the lower branches of trees. Its movements were surprisingly graceful for something so large, and then, in a heart-stopping moment, it turned and looked directly at me. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes clearly through my telephoto lens. They were startlingly intelligent, a deep amber color that seemed to glow with an inner light. There was something unsettlingly human in that gaze, a spark of recognition, of awareness. I froze, my finger hovering over the shutter button. This was it, the moment every wildlife photographer dreams of, the perfect shot. The one-in-a-million chance to capture something truly extraordinary, but I couldn't do it. In that moment of eye contact, something passed between me and the creature, a understanding, perhaps, or a warning. Whatever it was, I knew with absolute certainty that taking this photo would be a violation of something sacred. Slowly, deliberately, the creature raised one massive hand and pressed a finger to its lips in a universal gesture of silence. Then, with a grace that belied its size, it melted back into the forest, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and trembling hands. I sat in my blind for a long time after that, trying to process what I had seen. Part of me wanted to pack up my gear and race back to civilization to tell everyone about my incredible encounter. But a larger part knew that I shouldn't do that. As the light began to fade, I finally emerged from my blind on shaky legs. The forest had returned to normal, filled with the usual evening sounds of birds and small animals. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I made my way back to my campsite in a daze, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. The intelligence in those eyes, the deliberate gesture of silence. This wasn't just some undiscovered animal. This was a being with awareness, with intent. That night, as I lay in my tent, listening to the wind in the trees, I made a decision. The photos I had taken that day, beautiful landscapes and common wildlife, would be submitted to National Geographic as planned. But the real story, the encounter that had changed everything, would remain my secret. The next morning, I packed up my gear and began the long hike back to civilization. As I walked, I found myself pausing often to scan the forest around me. Were those eyes watching me from the shadows? Was that movement in the undergrowth just a deer or something more? I've been back to those mountains many times since that day, always hoping for another glimpse of the incredible creature I encountered. But whether by chance or by choice, our paths have never crossed again. Sometimes, in the years since, I've questioned my decision not to take that photo. It could have made my career, could have changed our understanding of the natural world. But then I remember those eyes, that gesture of silence, and I know I made the right choice. There are mysteries in this world that aren't meant to be solved, secrets that should remain hidden in the wild places. My encounter taught me that sometimes the greatest act of respect a photographer can show is to lower the camera and simply witness. I still dream about those eyes sometimes, intelligent, aware, and filled with a wisdom beyond human understanding. They remind me that no matter how much we think we know about the world around us, there are still wonders waiting to be discovered. And some of those wonders, perhaps, are best left undiscovered. As I sit here in my studio, surrounded by the photos I've taken over the years, I often find my gaze drawn to a blank space on the wall. It's where the photo of the creature would have hung, had I taken it. But that empty space tells a story too, one of respect, of mystery, and of the humbling realization that we humans don't know nearly as much as we think we do. The forests of the Pacific Northwest still call to me, and I still answer that call. But now, when I venture into the wilderness with my camera, I do so with a newfound reverence. Because I know that somewhere out there, in the misty depths of the ancient forests, there are eyes watching back. And some secrets, I've learned, are best left in the shadows. Story 20. I've always believed that true horror lies not in what you can see, but in what you can't. It's the unknown that truly terrifies us, the darkness that our minds fill with unimaginable horrors. But on that day in the Appalachian wilderness, I learned that sometimes reality can be far more terrifying than anything our imaginations can conjure. My name is Emily, and I'm an experienced solo hiker. I've traversed some of the most challenging trails in North America, always pushing myself to go further, to explore the untouched corners of the wild. But nothing in my years of adventure could have prepared me for what I encountered in that unmapped cave. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day hike through a lesser-known section of the Appalachian Trail. I had packed light, bringing only the essentials, a small tent, dehydrated meals, water purification tablets, and my trusty hiking poles. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air with just a hint of the coming winter. The first day and a half of my hike were uneventful. I reveled in the solitude, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and the occasional glimpse of wildlife scurrying through the underbrush. It was on the afternoon of the second day that everything changed. I had veered slightly off the main trail, following a deer path that seemed to lead towards a promising viewpoint. The forest here was older, the trees towering giants that blocked out much of the sunlight. As I pushed through a particularly dense thicket, I suddenly found myself in a small clearing, and there it was, the mouth of a cave, partially hidden by a curtain of vines and moss. It wasn't marked on any of my maps, which only piqued my curiosity. As an avid caver in my college days, the temptation to explore was irresistible. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The entrance was narrow, but seemed to open up further in. Cool air wafted out, carrying with it a musty, earthy scent. Against my better judgment, I decided to take a quick look inside. The first few yards were typical of many caves I'd explored before, damp walls, the occasional stalactite. Nothing out of the ordinary, but as I ventured deeper, I noticed something odd. The floor was unusually smooth, almost as if it had been worn down by frequent passage. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing something that made me pause. There were markings, not the graffiti left by careless tourists, but deep gouges in the rock. They looked almost like claw marks, but far larger than anything I'd ever seen before. A shiver ran down my spine, but I pressed on. The cave seemed to be leading downward, spiraling into the earth. I knew I should turn back, that I was ill-equipped for serious caving, but curiosity drove me forward. After about 10 minutes of careful descent, I emerged into a larger chamber. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling, giving me an unsettling feeling of being swallowed by the earth. But it was what I saw on the floor of the chamber that truly chilled me to the bone. Bones, hundreds of them, scattered across the cave floor. Most appeared to be from animals, deer, maybe some bears. But there were others that looked disturbingly human-like, and all of them bore the same deep scratch marks I'd seen on the walls. My heart raced as I realized I had stumbled upon something I was never meant to see. This wasn't just a cave, it was a lair, a feeding ground for something large, something predatory. I turned to leave, my flashlight beam shaking with my trembling hands. That's when I heard it, a deep, rumbling breath echoing from deeper within the cave. Panic seized me. I scrambled back towards the entrance, my boots slipping on the smooth stone floor. The breathing grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of something large moving in the darkness behind me. I reached the narrow passage that led back to the surface. Squeezing through as fast as I could, my backpack caught on a protruding rock, and I shrugged it off without a second thought, leaving it behind in my desperation to escape. Just as I thought I was clear, something grabbed my ankle. I screamed, kicking wildly. My foot connected with something solid, and I heard a grunt of pain. The grip loosened, and I burst out of the cave entrance. Not daring to look back, I ran through the forest, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning with exertion. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail, collapsing to my knees, gasping for air. As the adrenaline faded, I realized the gravity of my situation. I was miles from any help, without my backpack which contained my food, water, and emergency gear. The sun was setting, and I was alone in the wilderness, with the terrifying knowledge that something was out there, something that shouldn't exist. I had no choice but to start walking. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt oppressive, full of hidden dangers. Night fell, and with it came a bone-chilling cold. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified, but I knew I couldn't stop. Whatever was in that cave might be hunting me, using senses far keener than my own to track me through the darkness. It was nearing midnight when I heard it, a howl that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was too deep to be a wolf, too guttural to be a bear. It echoed through the forest, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I broke into a run, abandoning all attempts at stealth. Branches tore at my clothes, roots threatened to trip me, but fear drove me onward. I could hear something moving through the forest behind me, keeping pace effortlessly. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw lights through the trees. The ranger station. I'd made it back to civilization. I burst out of the tree line, screaming for help. The rangers were shocked by my appearance, clothes torn, face scratched, eyes wild with fear. As they ushered me inside and began treating my injuries, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to my own ears. A cave full of bones, a creature that couldn't possibly exist. They assumed I had gotten lost and panicked, my mind playing tricks on me in the darkness. Part of me wanted to believe them, to dismiss the whole experience as a stress-induced hallucination, but I knew what I had seen, what I had heard, what had grabbed my ankle in that cave. The rangers organized a search party to retrieve my abandoned backpack, but they found no sign of it, no sign of the cave either. It was as if the entire thing had vanished into thin air. In the years since that day, I've tried to rationalize what happened. I've researched cryptozoology, delved into local legends, even consulted with geologists about undiscovered cave systems in the area. But I found no satisfactory explanation for what I encountered. I still hike, still love the wilderness, but I never go alone anymore, and I always stick to the marked trails. Because I know now that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the dark places where humans rarely tread. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that inhuman howl echoing in the distance. In those moments, I'm back in that cave, staring at those impossibly large claw marks, feeling the grip on my ankle, and I wonder, what if it followed me out? What if, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Appalachians, it's still out there, waiting, watching, hungry? I used to believe that the greatest thrill in hiking was discovering something new. Now I know better. Some discoveries are better left unmade, some mysteries better left unsolved. Because once you've glimpsed the impossible, once you've felt the breath of something ancient and predatory on the back of your neck, you can never truly feel safe in the wilderness again. So if you're ever hiking in the Appalachians and you come across an unmarked cave, do yourself a favor. Keep walking. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Because you never know what might be waiting in the darkness, watching with hungry eyes, ready to pull you into a world of nightmares from which there may be no escape. Story 21. I used to think the scariest thing in a lake was the occasional snapping turtle or a fish brushing against your leg. But that was before that day on Crater Lake, when my brother and I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Something that turned our peaceful fishing trip into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. My name is Jack, and my younger brother Alex and I have been avid fishermen since we were kids. We grew up in Oregon, spending our summers exploring the countless lakes and rivers that dot the landscape. But Crater Lake was always special. Its deep, crystal-clear waters and the mystery of its volcanic origin drew us back year after year. It was a crisp autumn morning when we set out, our small motorboat loaded with fishing gear and enough supplies for a long day on the water. The lake was calm, its surface like a mirror reflecting the surrounding cliffs and the vibrant blue sky above. As we motored out to our favorite spot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about the lake that day. The air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm, though there wasn't a cloud in sight. "You feel that?" I asked Alex as we cut the engine and drifted to a stop. He nodded, his eyes scanning the water. "Yeah, it's weird. Like the whole lake is holding its breath or something." We cast our lines and settled in for what we hoped would be a productive day of fishing. Hours passed with barely a nibble. The usual sounds of birds and small animals that echoed off the caldera walls were strangely absent. It was as if the entire area was enveloped in a bubble of silence. As the sun began to dip towards the western rim of the crater, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, we decided to try one last spot before calling it a day. We were about halfway across the lake when we heard it, a long, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Alex and I exchanged puzzled looks. "That wasn't a wolf," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "No way, too deep and way too loud. Besides, there aren't any wolves around Crater Lake." We scanned the shoreline, looking for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, a dark shape emerging from the tree line on the far shore. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but as it moved into the open, I realized it was something else entirely. Even from this distance, I could tell it was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It walked on 2 legs, its body covered in thick, dark fur. But it wasn't the size that made my blood run cold. It was the way it moved. There was an intelligence in its gait, a purposefulness that no ordinary animal should possess. "Jack!" Alex's voice cracked as he pointed. "What the hell is that?" Before I could answer, the creature turned its head and looked directly at us. Even across the expanse of the lake, I could feel the weight of its gaze. Then, to our horror, it began to wade into the water. "Start the engine," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Now, Alex!" He scrambled to the outboard motor, yanking the cord. The engine sputtered but didn't catch. All the while, the creature was moving deeper into the lake, its powerful arms cutting through the water with frightening efficiency. "It's not starting!" Alex yelled, panic evident in his voice. I joined him at the stern, both of us pulling the cord with all our might. The creature was halfway across the lake now, moving far faster than any human swimmer could. Finally, mercifully, the engine roared to life. I gunned it, steering us towards the nearest shore. But as the boat lurched forward, I risked a glance back, and my heart nearly stopped. The creature was gone. The surface of the lake where it had been was calm, undisturbed. "Where is it?" Alex asked, his knuckles white as he gripped the side of the boat. I scanned the water, my whole body tense. "I don't know, I don't see—" My words were cut short as something massive slammed into the bottom of the boat, nearly capsizing us. Alex lost his balance and fell, narrowly avoiding going overboard. "Hold on!" I yelled, pushing the engine to its limit. We skipped across the surface of the lake, the impact of whatever was beneath us threatening to tear the boat apart. Suddenly, a huge, hair-covered arm burst out of the water, clawed hand grasping for the side of the boat. I swerved hard, nearly throwing Alex and myself into the lake. The creature's arm sliced through the air where we had just been, missing us by inches. We were nearing the shore now, but I knew we'd never make it to the boat ramp. "Get ready to jump!" I shouted to Alex. "Head for those rocks." As we approached the rocky shoreline, I cut the engine and we leapt from the boat, hitting the frigid water with a shock that drove the air from my lungs. We swam with desperate strokes, clambering onto the jagged rocks as our boat drifted away, now nothing more than a bobbing target for whatever was in the water. We watched, panting and shivering, as our boat suddenly jerked violently and was pulled under the surface. It disappeared with barely a ripple, leaving nothing but expanding circles on the lake's surface. What was that thing?" Alex gasped, his eyes wide with terror. I shook my head, unable to form words. We were both in shock, our minds struggling to process what we had just witnessed. As the adrenaline began to fade, I realized how precarious our situation was. We were stranded on a remote section of shoreline, soaking wet as night approached, with no supplies and no way to call for help. And somewhere out in that vast, deep lake, there was a creature unlike anything known to science, a creature that had nearly killed us. "We need to move," I said, forcing myself to focus on immediate survival. "We can follow the shoreline back to the lodge. If we're lucky, we can make it before full dark." Alex nodded, his face pale but determined. We set off along the rocky shore, our wet clothes chafing with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that at any moment that nightmarish creature might emerge from the water to finish what it had started. The sun had long since dipped below the caldera rim by the time we stumbled into the parking lot of Crater Lake Lodge. The night staff were shocked by our appearance and our wild story. They called the park rangers, who listened to our account with obvious skepticism. "Look," one ranger said, not unkindly, "I know you boys believe what you saw, but Crater Lake has been extensively studied. There's no way something that big could be living in there without us knowing about it." But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the slight hesitation in his voice. How many other stories like ours had been dismissed over the years? In the days that followed, search teams found no trace of our boat or any evidence to support our story. The official report cited equipment failure and exhaustion as the likely causes of our shared hallucination. Alex and I knew better. We had seen something that day, something that defied explanation, something that had been hiding in the depths of Crater Lake for who knows how long. We never went fishing on Crater Lake again. In fact, we've barely set foot near any large body of water since that day. The memory of that creature, its intelligent eyes and grasping claws, is seared into our minds. Sometimes, when I see news reports of mysterious disappearances in lakes or unexplained water phenomena, I wonder, is it out there still, lurking in the depths of Crater Lake? Or are there more of them, scattered across the world's deep lakes and oceans, watching and waiting? One thing I know for certain: the next time you're near a large body of water and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, don't dismiss it. There are things in this world that we can't explain, creatures that defy our understanding of nature. And sometimes they're a lot closer than we think. So if you ever find yourself on Crater Lake, enjoying its serene beauty and crystal-clear waters, just remember, you might not be alone out there. And whatever is sharing those waters with you, it might be hungry, and it might be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to rise from the depths and pull you down into its dark, watery world. Story 22. As a biologist, I've always believed in the power of observation. But on that fateful day in the Olympic National Forest, I learned that sometimes what you observe can shake the very foundations of everything you thought you knew about the natural world. My name is Lisa Chen, and this is the story of how a routine field study turned into an encounter with the impossible. I'd been working on a biodiversity survey in the remote corners of the Olympic Peninsula for the past 3 months. It was grueling work, but the kind that filled me with purpose. Every day brought new discoveries, from rare lichens to elusive mammals, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found on that misty morning in late October. The day started like any other. I woke before dawn, the chill air nipping at my nose as I emerged from my tent. The forest was shrouded in a thick fog, giving everything an ethereal quality. As I sipped my instant coffee, I planned my route for the day, a trek into a particularly dense section of old-growth forest that we hadn't yet fully explored. I set out just as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the canopy. The forest was alive with the sounds of morning, birds calling, small animals rustling in the underbrush. I breathed deeply, savoring the rich, earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. About 2 hours into my hike, I came across a small clearing. That's when I saw them, the tracks. At first glance, they looked almost human, but as I knelt down to examine them more closely, I realized they were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The prints were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot, but it wasn't just the size that was unusual. The shape was all wrong. They were elongated, with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips of each toe, and the stride length, it was impossible. Whatever had made these tracks was covering ground at an alarming rate. My scientific mind raced through possibilities. A bear, walking on its hind legs? No, the shape was all wrong, and bears don't leave claw marks like these. Some undiscovered primate species? In Washington state, it seemed absurd. Curiosity overrode caution, and I decided to follow the tracks. They led me deeper into the forest, to areas I hadn't yet explored. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. After about an hour of tracking, I emerged into another clearing. What I saw there made my blood run cold. The area looked like a scene from a nature documentary about elephant rampages, but we were thousands of miles from the nearest elephant. Trees were snapped like twigs, some uprooted entirely. Deep gouges ran down the trunks of the still-standing trees, as if something massive had been sharpening its claws. And there, in the center of the destruction, was a perfect impression in the soft earth, as if something huge had sat down to rest. My hands shook as I took out my camera, snapping photo after photo. This was beyond anything in my experience. Whatever had done this was incredibly strong and incredibly large. As I circled the clearing, taking measurements and samples, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. There, just at the edge of the tree line, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something large, covered in dark fur, melted back into the shadows. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. It was too big to be a bear, too swift and agile to be anything I could readily identify. For a moment, a word I'd dismissed as mere folklore flashed through my mind: Sasquatch. But before I could even begin to grapple with that impossible thought, a deep, rumbling growl echoed through the clearing. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite animal, not quite human, but somehow both at once. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that whatever was out there could easily outpace me. So I stood my ground, my breath coming in short gasps, as the bushes at the edge of the clearing began to rustle and part. What emerged was beyond my wildest imaginings. It was tall, easily 8 feet or more, and covered in thick, matted fur. Its body was powerfully built, with long arms that nearly reached its knees, but it was the face that truly shocked me. It was almost human-like, with deep-set eyes that shone with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I was paralyzed with a mixture of fear and awe. This was a creature that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught. Yet here it was, real and undeniable, Slowly, deliberately, the creature raised one massive hand and pressed a finger to its lips in a clear gesture of silence. Then, with a grace that belied its size, it turned and melted back into the forest, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and shaking hands. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to follow it, to document this earth-shattering discovery. But a larger part knew that some secrets aren't meant to be uncovered, some mysteries better left unsolved. As I made my way back to camp, my mind was in turmoil. How could I possibly report this? Who would believe me? I had the photos of the tracks and the destroyed clearing, but no clear evidence of the creature itself. Would I be laughed out of the scientific community if I came forward with this? That night, as I lay in my tent listening to the sounds of the forest, I made a decision. The world wasn't ready for this discovery. The consequences of revealing the existence of such a creature could be catastrophic. For the scientific community, for the public, and most importantly, for the creature itself. I deleted the photos from my camera, my finger hesitating only briefly over the button. In my field journal, I recorded only the basic facts of my route that day, omitting any mention of the tracks or the clearing. In the years since that day, I've returned to the Olympic National Forest many times. I've never seen the creature again. But sometimes, when the mist rolls in and the forest grows quiet, I can almost feel its presence. A reminder that there are still mysteries in this world, still wonders undiscovered. I've heard the stories from locals, tales of strange sounds in the night, of glimpsed shapes in the forest that defy explanation. I listen politely, neither confirming nor denying, but I know the truth. I've seen it with my own eyes. There are nights when I question my decision to keep silent. The biologist in me rails against the suppression of such a monumental discovery. But then I remember the intelligence in those eyes, the deliberate gesture of silence, and I know I made the right choice. Because sometimes the greatest service we can do for nature is to let its mysteries remain unsolved. To acknowledge that there are still wild things in this world that exist beyond our understanding or control. So if you ever find yourself in the deep forests of the Olympic Peninsula, and you hear a sound that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, or see a shadow that seems too large to be a known animal, remember my story. Remember that there are things in this world that defy scientific explanation, and remember that sometimes it's better to let sleeping giants lie. Because once you've seen the impossible, once you've locked eyes with a legend, you can never go back. The world becomes a different place, bigger, wilder, and filled with possibilities that both terrify and exhilarate. As for me, I continue my work as a biologist. But now, when I venture into the wilderness, I do so with a newfound sense of humility, because I know that no matter how much we think we understand about the natural world, there are always surprises waiting to be discovered, and some of those surprises are better left hidden in the mist-shrouded forests of the Pacific Northwest. Story 23. I've guided hundreds of hunting trips in my career, but none haunt me like the expedition into the Blackfoot Valley. It was supposed to be a routine elk hunt. Instead, it became a nightmare that turned predator into prey and left us questioning everything we thought we knew about the wilderness. My name is Ryan Cooper, and this is the story of the night something hunted us. It was late October, prime elk season in Montana. I'd been hired by a group of 4 friends from Chicago, businessmen looking to escape the city for a taste of the wild. They were experienced hunters, but nothing could have prepared them, or me, for what awaited us in those remote mountains. We set out just before dawn, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of pine. The forest was alive with the sounds of awakening wildlife, and a sense of anticipation hung over our group. Little did we know that excitement would soon turn to terror. The first day went smoothly. We tracked a small herd of elk, but didn't get close enough for a clean shot. As dusk approached, we made camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The mood was jovial as we sat around the campfire, sharing stories and passing around a flask of whiskey. It was around midnight when things started to feel off. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. "You hear that?" Tom, the oldest of the group, whispered. We all strained our ears, but there was nothing to hear. And that was the problem. "I don't like this, Ryan," Mike, another member of the group, said. "Something ain't right." I tried to reassure them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Years of experience in these woods had honed my instincts, and right now, every one of them was screaming danger. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion. It was something else. "Get the rifles," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Form a circle, backs to the fire." The men scrambled to obey, their eyes wide with fear as they scanned the darkness beyond our campfire's glow. I could see their breath coming in short, panicked gasps, forming small clouds in the cold night air. Another growl, closer this time. Then another, from the opposite direction. Whatever was out there, there was more than one. "Ryan," Tom's voice quavered. "What the hell is that?" Before I could answer, something burst from the underbrush. In the flickering firelight, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, moving with a speed that defied its size. "Shoot!" I yelled, raising my own rifle. The sound of gunfire shattered the night. Muzzle flashes illuminated the clearing in strobe-like bursts, revealing fleeting images of our attackers. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before, not quite bear, not quite human, but some terrifying combination of the two. "We need to move," I shouted over the gunfire. "Head for the trucks." We took off running, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear heavy footfalls behind us, branches snapping as our pursuers gave chase. The trucks were parked about a mile away, down a winding trail. It might as well have been 100 miles. As we ran, I realized with growing horror that we were being herded. Every time we tried to veer off course, a growl or a shadowy movement would force us back on path. These things, whatever they were intelligent. They were hunting us. We burst out of the tree line into a small meadow, the moonlight providing brief respite from the oppressive darkness of the forest. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the starry sky. It was bipedal, covered in thick, shaggy fur, but it was the eyes that struck me most. They gleamed with an almost human intelligence, filled with a predatory cunning that made my blood run cold. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. We stared at the creature, and it stared back at us. I could hear the ragged breathing of the men around me, smell the acrid stench of fear and sweat. Then, with a roar that shook leaves from the trees, it charged. "Run!" I screamed, snapping out of my trance. Don't stop. Don't look back." We tore across the meadow, the sound of pursuit spurring us on. I could hear the creature's heavy breathing, feel the ground shake with each of its strides. It was toying with us, I realized. It could have caught us at any time. As we reached the far side of the meadow, I risked a glance back. The creature had stopped at the edge of the tree line. It stood there, watching us flee, as if marking its territory. Then, with deliberate slowness, it raised a massive, clawed hand and pressed a finger to its lips in a chilling gesture of silence. We didn't stop running until we reached the trucks. As we peeled out of the parking area, tires spitting gravel, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror, multiple pairs of eyes glowing in the darkness, watching us leave their domain. The drive back to civilization was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd experienced. It wasn't until we reached the small town at the foot of the mountains that anyone spoke. What were those things?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to form words. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? In all my years in these mountains, I'd heard stories, tales of Bigfoot, of creatures that lurked in the deep woods. But I'd always dismissed them as campfire legends, stories to scare tourists and amuse locals. Now, I wasn't so sure. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the shell-shocked faces of my clients, I knew we had a decision to make. Do we report what we saw? Try to convince authorities that there were unknown creatures in those mountains? Or do we stay silent, protecting both the secret of the forest and our own reputations? In the end, we chose silence. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be laughed out of town, our careers and credibility in tatters. But we made a pact that day, swearing to never return to that part of the mountains, to never speak of what we'd seen. Years have passed since that night, but the memory remains as vivid as ever. I still guide hunting trips, but never in that area. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear distant howls echoing from those remote peaks, a reminder of the night we became the hunted. I've heard stories since then, whispered tales of other encounters, of hunters and hikers who ventured into those mountains and came back changed, if they came back at all. Each time I bite my tongue, fighting the urge to warn them, to tell them what's really out there. Because the truth is, there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that exist in the shadows of our understanding. That night in the Blackfoot Valley, we glimpsed something ancient and powerful, something that had been there long before us and would remain long after we're gone. So if you ever find yourself in the wilds of Montana and you hear a sound that makes your hair stand on end, or see a shadow that seems too large to be natural, remember my story. Remember that in the deepest parts of the wilderness, there are predators beyond our understanding, and sometimes, just sometimes, we're not at the top of the food chain. As for me, I'll keep guiding hunts, keep exploring the wilderness I love. But now, I do it with a newfound respect for the unknown, for the mysteries that still lurk in the dark corners of our world. Because once you've been hunted by the impossible, you never quite see the forest the same way again.